The summer heat pressed down on Brooklyn like a curse. It was 1920, and the city smelled of sweat, gasoline, and the sour tang of bootleg whiskey that leaked from hidden crates stacked behind barbershops and butcher stalls. Men with sharp suits and sharper tongues walked those streets, but none of them cast a longer shadow than Frankie Yale. To some, he was a protector. To others, a tyrant. To everyone who whispered his name, he was the Godfather of Brooklyn. Frankie had carved his empire from blood and ambition. Born Francesco Yale, he had come to America with nothing but a pair of working hands and a hunger that would shame kings. Brooklyn hardened him. The alleys taught him not to flinch at screams. The taverns showed him how a smile could hide a knife. By the time Prohibition swept through, Frankie was already more than a street tough. He was a businessman, though the kind of business he handled always left stains that no soap could wash. That evening, Frankie sat in his club, the Harvard Inn, a place where the walls dripped with jazz and the air buzzed with smoke thick enough to choke a priest. He leaned back in his chair, a glass of whiskey at his side, though he rarely drank it himself. Control was his religion. And a drunken man couldn't control anything, not even his temper. His black hair was slicked back neat, his suit a shade too fine for most men in the room. Around him, laughter spilled, dice clattered, and the piano man worked the keys like his life depended on it. But Frankie wasn't listening to the music. His eyes, cold and sharp, studied the faces that moved through his establishment. He trusted no one completely, not even the men who swore loyalty to him with their lives. Trust was a word for fools, and fools didn't live long in Brooklyn. "Capone, get over here," Frankie called, his voice cutting through the noise. A young Al Capone, still wet behind the ears, hustled over. The boy had fire in him, Frankie could see that, but fire needed shaping, or it burned itself out. Capone was muscle, strong, quick with his fists, and eager to prove himself. Frankie had been watching him closely, testing him in small jobs, watching how he handled pressure, how he looked at money, how he handled disrespect. "You watching, kid?" Frankie asked, his gaze still locked on the crowd. Capone nodded, eyes sharp, shoulders square. "Always, boss." "That's how you stay alive in this game," Frankie said. "You watch, you don't sleep too easy, you don't trust smiles, and you never, ever let a man think you're weaker than him. You do that once, you'll be sleeping with dirt in your mouth." Capone smirked, trying to hide the nervous respect he had for the older man. Frankie's words were lessons carved in steel. A burst of laughter erupted from a table nearby, where a few men from Manhattan were throwing dice. Frankie's jaw tightened. Outsiders. He didn't like outsiders in his house unless they were paying him directly. Brooklyn was his territory and everyone knew it. Still, he let them play. For now. The night dragged on, but Frankie's mind was never at ease. Even when the crowd cheered, even when the jazz swelled, his ears picked up whispers, the wrong laugh, the too long glance, the scrape of a chair that didn't belong. Power didn't let him sleep. It kept him restless, always searching for the knife he knew would come one day. Every gangster story ended the same way, with betrayal, with bullets, with silence. The only question was when. As midnight slipped past, Frankie finally rose from his chair. He nodded to Capone, who followed close behind. Outside, the street was cooler, but no less dangerous. The city never slept, and neither did Frankie Yale. Every alley held secrets, every shadow carried a threat. Yet he walked with his head high, as if daring the night to test him. Inside his own mind, though, he knew the truth. A gangster could rule by fear, by money, by blood, but sooner or later, every man had to close his eyes. And Frankie hated the thought of sleep more than he hated his enemies, because sleep meant letting go. Sleep meant being vulnerable. And Frankie Yale didn't trust the world enough to let go. That night, as he stepped into his car, the thought crossed his mind again. One day I'll sleep, and that'll be the end of me. But for now, he kept his eyes wide open. The morning after always felt different for Frankie Yale. Most men woke up to aches and hangovers, their heads pounding from cheap whiskey and late-night laughs. Frankie, though, rose like a general before battle, showered, shaved, and dressed sharp, long before most of his men even rolled out of bed. He didn't allow himself the luxury of sluggishness. In his world, the second you slowed down was the second a bullet found you. Brooklyn was alive outside his window, its streets filled with the sounds of carts rattling over cobblestone, children shouting, and the distant whistle of a train. He sat at the table with his breakfast, black coffee, no sugar, no milk, and a slice of bread with olive oil. Simple, efficient, like the man himself. Across from him sat a woman, his second wife, Lucy, her hair curled, her robe wrapped loose. She looked tired, her eyes dull from years of pretending not to hear what she heard, of pretending not to know where Frankie had been or what blood stained the cuffs of his immaculate shirts. "You're up early again," she muttered, pushing a curl behind her ear. "I don't sleep late," Frankie replied flatly. "You don't sleep at all," she said under her breath. He ignored her, standing and buttoning his jacket. He had no time for complaints. A man like him didn't build empires with sympathy. Empires came from coldness, from steel nerves, from ignoring softness even when it stared at you over coffee. By the time Frankie stepped outside, his driver, Tony, was already waiting beside a gleaming Packard. Tony was loyal, thick shoulders, scar above his eyebrow, eyes that never stopped scanning. Frankie trusted him more than most, but even Tony was kept on a short leash. "Morning, boss," Tony said, opening the back door. Frankie slid inside, lighting a cigarette. "We're going to the warehouse first, then the inn. I want to check the books." Tony nodded and pulled the car into motion, weaving through Brooklyn's busy streets. The warehouse sat near the docks, a squat brick building with iron doors and men posted outside with their hands hidden beneath coats. Inside, barrels of Canadian whiskey were stacked high, their labels crudely scratched off. Prohibition had turned ordinary liquor into gold, and Frankie controlled the flow through half of Brooklyn. He didn't just sell drinks, he sold power. Men who wanted to keep their speakeasies running, their clubs alive, their pockets fat. They all paid Frankie. "Everything's accounted for, boss," one of his lieutenants, Carlo, said, handing him a ledger. "But we got whispers, Manhattan boys sniffing around, looking to cut into the docks." Frankie scanned the pages, then closed the book with a snap. His dark eyes flicked to Carlo. "Which Manhattan boys?" "Some outfit tied to the D'Aquila family," Carlo replied, nervous. "They've been seen around Red Hook, asking questions." Frankie's jaw tightened. Salvatore D'Aquila, Manhattan's self-styled boss of bosses. A man who thought Brooklyn should bow to him, who sent his men like dogs to sniff out weakness. Frankie hated him. They'd crossed paths before, uneasy allies when business required it, but rivals in truth. D'Aquila wanted everything. Frankie wanted Brooklyn. And he would burn Manhattan to ash before bending. "Double the guards at the docks," Frankie ordered. "And any man you catch from Manhattan sniffing around here, don't question him, don't warn him, put him in the river." Carlo nodded, swallowing hard. Frankie's rules were simple, brutal, and absolute. That was why he was still alive. By midday, Frankie was back at the Harvard Inn. The club was quiet in the daylight, chairs stacked, floors swept, the piano silent. But in the back room, the real work happened. Frankie sat with his accountant, numbers spread before him, Capone sitting in the corner like a student waiting for a lesson. "You keep watching, kid," Frankie said to Capone, not looking up from the papers. "Money's the blood. The streets, the fights, the guns. That's just noise. The money tells you who's loyal, who's stealing, who's starving. You learn to read it like a priest reads the Bible." Capone leaned forward, eager, hungry. "And if someone's stealing," Frankie looked up then, his stare sharp as a blade. "You don't shout. You don't make a scene. You put a hand on his shoulder, smile, and walk him outside. Then you put two in his head and let the rats finish the sermon." Capone nodded, the lesson searing itself into him. He admired Frankie, the way he commanded respect without screaming, the way fear seemed to settle in every room he entered. Capone wanted that for himself, but for now, he watched, he listened, he learned. The afternoon bled into evening. By nightfall, the Harvard Inn came alive again. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses, all of it humming like a machine Frankie had built with his own two hands. He moved through the room like a king among subjects, greeting some with smiles, others with nothing more than a glance that reminded them of their place. But beneath the surface, tension gnawed at him. The whispers of Manhattan rivals weren't just smoke, they were fire waiting to spread. Sure enough, trouble arrived before midnight. A messenger boy slipped through the crowd, sweating, eyes wide. He found Frankie near the bar and shoved a folded note into his hand. Frankie opened it, his expression unreadable as his eyes flicked across the scrawled words. Yale, Manhattan men seen at Red Hook tonight, armed, asking for you by name. Frankie folded the note, slipped it into his pocket, and signaled to Capone. Come on, kid. Time you saw how Brooklyn handles intruders. The Packard roared through the night, headlights cutting through darkness as they sped toward the docks. Capone sat beside Frankie, his fists clenched, his heart racing. This was what he'd been waiting for. Real action, not just lessons over books and whiskey. When they arrived, the air stank of salt and tar. The docks loomed silent, broken only by the creak of ships against the tide. Frankie stepped out first, his hand resting inside his jacket. Capone followed, nerves tight but masked behind a hard stare. They didn't have to search long. 3 men stood near a stack of crates, their suits too clean, their accents too polished. Manhattan rats, no doubt. One of them puffed on a cigarette, smirking as Frankie approached. Evening, Yale, the man said smoothly. Word travels fast. We were just taking a look around. Beautiful docks you got here. Frankie didn't smile. Brooklyn ain't a zoo. You don't come here to look around. The man chuckled, glancing at his partners. D'Aquila just wants to make sure the liquor's flowing fair. Business is business, you know. Frankie's eyes narrowed. His hand moved fast, pulling the pistol from his jacket. The crack of the gun shattered the night as the man dropped, a hole in his forehead, his cigarette still burning on the ground beside him. The other 2 reached for their weapons, but Capone was quicker than either expected. His pistol barked twice, dropping both before they could clear leather. Smoke hung in the air, sharp and bitter, mixing with the salt of the sea. Capone's chest heaved, his ears ringing. He stared at the bodies, the red blooming across their shirts. Frankie turned to him, calm, steady, like he'd just flicked ash from a cigar. You see now? Frankie said. This is Brooklyn. You don't talk. You don't negotiate. You don't give Manhattan an inch or they'll take the whole street. Capone nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. For the first time, he felt the weight of what it meant to walk in Frankie Yale's shadow. Power wasn't glamour. It was blood. Frankie glanced down at the corpses, then back at his men. Dump 'em. Let the tide carry the message. They worked quickly, rolling the bodies into the dark water. The splash echoed across the docks, swallowed by the night. As Frankie and Capone climbed back into the Packard, Frankie lit another cigarette. His face was expressionless, his eyes distant. For him, this was just another day, another lesson, another warning sent. But deep inside, a thought gnawed at him, the same thought that haunted him every night. Brooklyn was his, yes. But enemies never slept. And one day, when his guard slipped, when exhaustion finally claimed him, someone would be waiting. For now, though, Frankie Yale didn't sleep. He only watched, plotted, and survived. The next week in Brooklyn felt like a storm building, though the skies stayed clear. Frankie Yale went about his business as usual, checking the books, visiting speakeasies, and moving shipments across the East River. But every man under him could sense the air shifting. When 3 Manhattan men vanish overnight, news doesn't stay quiet. Rumors were already running through the neighborhoods like rats through alleys. Some said Yale had struck first. Others whispered that D'Aquila would come down hard. Everyone knew blood was on the horizon. Frankie, however, showed no crack in his composure. He walked the streets of Brooklyn with his head high, a silk tie around his neck and a pistol in his coat. Respect and fear followed in his wake. Shopkeepers tipped their hats nervously, mothers pulled their children closer, and young men stared in awe at the power he carried in every step. But Frankie's confidence was not arrogance. It was armor. Inside, his mind was restless. Every night when the music at the Harvard Inn died down and the laughter faded, he lay in bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of footsteps outside his door. On the 3rd night after the dock killings, Capone found him alone in the back room of the inn, a cigar smoldering between his fingers. The boy looked eager, restless in a way only the young can be. "Boss," Capone said, leaning on the table. "Word's out. Manhattan knows. They'll be coming. Frankie exhaled smoke, slow and calm. Good. Let 'em come. Brooklyn ain't afraid of Manhattan. Capone grinned. I'm not afraid either. Frankie studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing. Fear keeps a man sharp, kid. Don't confuse fear with weakness. The man who says he ain't afraid is either a liar or a corpse waiting for dirt. Capone didn't flinch, though the words stung. He wanted to be seen as fearless, but Frankie was right. Fear was real. Still, Capone carried something else inside him, a hunger for violence, a need to prove himself. Frankie saw it, and though he valued it, he also feared it might consume the boy, if not controlled. That same night, trouble arrived. It was close to midnight when Tony, Frankie's driver, burst into the inn, his face pale. Boss! They hit the warehouse on 39th Street. Fire! Gunshots! Carlo's men are down. Frankie rose instantly, his chair scraping the floor. How many? Half a dozen, maybe more. They torched half the shipment. Carlo barely made it out alive. Frankie's jaw tightened, his fists clenched. D'Aquila had struck back, bold and brutal. Capone, Frankie barked, get the car, we're going. Within minutes, the Packard tore through Brooklyn, the headlights slicing the night. The closer they got, the stronger the smell of smoke and burning wood filled the air. When they arrived, the warehouse was half in ruins, flames licking at its sides, men coughing and bleeding in the street. Crates of whiskey lay shattered, liquid running like rivers of wasted gold. Carlo stumbled toward Frankie, his arm wrapped in a bloody cloth. Boss, they came fast. 3 cars, Tommy guns. We didn't stand a chance. Frankie grabbed him by the collar, pulling him close, his voice low and dangerous. Who led them? Carlo shook his head weakly. Didn't see, but they knew where to hit. They knew when. Frankie shoved him away, disgusted, not at Carlo's weakness, but at the thought of betrayal. For Manhattan to strike so clean, someone inside Brooklyn had whispered in their ear. That thought boiled in Frankie's veins like poison. Capone stood nearby, fists clenched, eyes burning as he stared at the flames. Let me take some men, boss. We'll hit them back. Tonight. Frankie turned, his expression hard as steel. No. Not tonight. Not like this. That's what they want. Brooklyn running wild, sloppy, angry. No. We wait, we watch, then we cut their hearts out clean. Capone bit his lip but nodded. Frankie's patience frustrated him, but he couldn't deny the man's wisdom. Still, the fire reflected in Capone's eyes told Frankie everything he needed to know. This boy would spill blood soon, and plenty of it. The following days were filled with tension. Frankie tightened his circle, moving meetings into private back rooms, keeping conversations short, testing loyalties with every word. He watched his men closely, Carlo, Tony, even his own brother. Someone had leaked to Manhattan, and Frankie intended to find out who. Meanwhile, the streets buzzed. Manhattan gangsters were spotted more often, their cars rolling slow through Brooklyn neighborhoods, their smirks daring Yale's men to make a move. The people noticed too, storekeepers whispering about Manhattan's boldness, women shaking their heads at the thought of war on their doorsteps. One night, Frankie sat with Capone in his office at the inn. The room was dim, the air thick with smoke. Frankie poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one across the table to the young man. You see what's happening, kid? Frankie asked quietly. Capone took a sip, nodding. They're testing us, Frankie smiled thinly. Not just testing, they're hunting. They want me stretched thin, paranoid, making mistakes. They want to see if Brooklyn's got a backbone without me. But I didn't build this empire to hand it over to some Manhattan rat. Capone leaned forward, his voice low and eager. So what do we do? Frankie tapped ash from his cigar, eyes cold. We hit back, but not just anywhere. We cut them where it hurts most. Money, respect. You take away a man's money, you take away his army, you take away his respect, you take away his soul. The plan was set. Over the next week, Frankie orchestrated a series of quiet but devastating strikes. Manhattan-owned gambling dens in Brooklyn were raided. A liquor shipment headed for D'Aquila's men vanished on the road, the drivers found later with their throats slit. A known informant turned up in an alley, his body riddled with bullets, a card stuffed in his mouth that read simply, Brooklyn. Each move was calculated, surgical, designed to send a message without giving D'Aquila a clear target in return. Frankie knew the art of war wasn't just fought with bullets, it was fought with fear, whispers, and silence. Capone was there for all of it. He watched, learned, and when given the chance, pulled the trigger himself. Each kill hardened him, shaping him into something darker, something hungrier. Frankie noticed the boy's grin when blood sprayed, the gleam in his eyes when enemies begged. It reminded him of himself, years ago. A dangerous mirror. But for all his control, Frankie couldn't control the one thing that haunted him most: betrayal. Late one night, as he sat alone in the Harvard Inn, the doors locked, the music long faded, Tony walked in with a look on his face Frankie didn't like. "What is it?" Frankie asked, not looking up from his drink. Tony hesitated, then spoke. "Boss, Carlo's been talking. Quiet, but I hear things. Meeting men he ain't supposed to meet. Manhattan men." Frankie froze, the glass halfway to his lips. Slowly, he set it down. His heart didn't race. He'd trained himself too well for that. But inside, fury burned like acid. "You sure?" Frankie asked. Tony nodded. "As sure as I've ever been. He's leaking, boss. That's how they knew the docs. That's how they knew when." For a long time, Frankie sat in silence, the weight of the truth pressing down. Carlo, his lieutenant, his trusted man, was the traitor. Finally, Frankie stood, his chair scraping the floor. "Bring him in tomorrow night. Don't say why. Just bring him, quiet, in the back room." Tony nodded and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Frankie stood alone in the silence, staring at the darkened bottles lined behind the bar. Betrayal was the cancer of his world. Every empire rotted from the inside before it fell to enemies outside. He had seen it happen to men before him, and now it was happening here. As he lit a cigarette, his reflection stared back from the bar mirror, sharp suit, slick hair, cold eyes. He was still in control, still the Godfather of Brooklyn. But somewhere deep in that reflection, he saw the shadow of the future. The shadow of a man who one day would close his eyes too long and never open them again. For now, though, Frankie Yale stayed awake, and tomorrow night, Brooklyn would bleed again. The Harvard Inn had seen laughter, music, and blood, often in the same night. But on this particular evening, the place carried a different kind of weight. Chairs were stacked, lights dimmed, doors locked from the inside. The music had stopped, the bartender sent home. Only Frankie Yale, a handful of his most trusted men, and Al Capone remained. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the smell of whiskey clung to the wood like sweat. Frankie sat at the head of the long backroom table, his suit immaculate, his hat resting nearby. In his hand, he rolled a silver lighter, flicking it open and closed, the soft click-clack echoing through the room. He was calm on the outside, but his silence said more than any shouting could. Tony entered, guiding Carlo by the arm. Carlo looked confused but not panicked, at least not yet. His face was bruised from the warehouse fire the week before, his arm still bandaged. He forced a smile when he saw Frankie. "Boss," Carlo said, his voice a little too eager. "What's this about? Tony says you wanted to see me, but he didn't say why." Frankie didn't answer. He just gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Carlo hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair. The silence stretched, heavy as stone. Capone leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching every movement with sharp, eager eyes. Finally, Frankie spoke, his voice low and steady. "You know what I hate most, Carlo?" Carlo licked his lips nervously. "What's that?" "Boss?" "Liars." Frankie lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and exhaled slow. "Thieves, too, but liars worse. A thief you can catch. A liar, though, a liar rots you from the inside." Carlo shifted in his seat. "Boss, I don't understand." Frankie slammed his hand down on the table, the lighter clattering. His voice didn't rise, but his tone cut like glass. "Don't insult me. Don't play dumb in my house." The room went dead silent. Frankie leaned forward, his eyes burning into Carlo's. Manhattan knew about the warehouse. They knew when. They knew how. That don't happen by accident. Carlo's face paled. He opened his mouth, then shut it, searching for words. Frankie continued, calm but deadly. You've been meeting with D'Aquila's men. Behind my back? You've been leaking, Carlo. You've been talking? Carlo shook his head frantically, sweat beading on his forehead. No, boss, no! I swear on my mother's grave, I never... Tony stepped forward, slamming a small folded piece of paper on the table. Frankie picked it up, unfolded it, and slid it toward Carlo. It was a note, scribbled quick. A list of times, places, and shipment details. Everyone matched Frankie's recent losses. Carlo's face went red, then white. He stammered, Boss, I don't know how they got that. It ain't mine. I swear. Frankie leaned back, taking a slow drag of his cigarette. You know what the problem with lying is, Carlo? You're not just lying to me. You're lying to yourself, and that makes you weak. Weak men don't last in Brooklyn. Capone stepped forward now, his young face hard, his voice sharp. You betrayed the boss. That's death, Carlo. You know the rules. Carlo's eyes darted to Capone, then back to Frankie, desperation spilling into his voice. Boss? I raised glasses with you. I bled for you. I took bullets for this crew. I got a family, kids. Frankie cut him off, his tone icy. So did the men who burned in that warehouse. You think their families got mercy? You think D'Aquila's gonna feed your kids? Carlo's hands shook as he pressed them against the table. Please, Frankie, please, just give me one more chance. I swear I'll make it right. For the first time, Frankie smiled, a cold, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stood slowly, smoothing his jacket, then walked around the table. The sound of his shoes on the wood echoed in the silence. He stopped behind Carlo, resting a hand on his shoulder. You know what I tell all my men, Carlo, Frankie said softly, almost kindly. I tell them never to get too comfortable, never to sleep too easy. Because in this life, the second you close your eyes, someone's waiting with a knife. Carlo's breath came fast and shallow. Boss, please. Frankie leaned close to his ear, his voice a whisper. You closed your eyes, Carlo. You slept on me. And now you don't wake up. Before Carlo could answer, Frankie pulled the pistol from his coat and pressed it against the back of Carlo's head. The gunshot cracked through the room, sharp and final. Carlo's body jolted, then slumped forward onto the table, blood spreading across the wood. Silence. Only the faint echo of the shot remained. Capone stared at the body, his heart pounding. He had seen men shot before, but this was different. This was family. Someone they'd shared meals with, laughed with, trusted. Betrayal wasn't an enemy's bullet. It was a knife from the inside. Frankie holstered the pistol calmly, like nothing had happened. He took another drag of his cigarette, blowing smoke into the air. Clean him up, Frankie said, his voice flat. Take him to the river. No coffin, no priest, just water and rats. Tony and another man moved quickly, dragging Carlo's limp body from the chair. The sound of blood dripping onto the floor followed them out. Capone remained frozen, his eyes still on the stain spreading across the table. Finally, he looked at Frankie. Boss. Frankie turned, his face unreadable. Lesson number 2, kid. Capone frowned. Lesson number 2. Frankie nodded. Loyalty is everything. You break it once, you're dead. No second chances. That's how you keep control. That's how you stay alive. Remember that. Capone swallowed hard, then nodded. Deep inside, a part of him admired Frankie more than ever. Another part, though, felt the weight of the lesson. It wasn't just enemies you had to fear, it was the men closest to you. The rest of the night passed in silence. Frankie poured himself another drink, though he barely touched it. Capone sat across from him, his young mind reeling, his hands still trembling slightly from the scene he had just witnessed. Frankie finally broke the silence. You did good tonight. You kept your mouth shut. You watched. That's how you learn. But remember this, Capone. Brooklyn ain't just streets and buildings. It's men. And men are liars, thieves, and traitors. If you want to be king, you got to be ready to kill your own. You understand? Capone's eyes burned as he nodded. I understand, boss. Frankie leaned back, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling. Good. Because one day, You'll need to remember it. One day, you'll be sitting in this chair, and the man across from you'll be begging for his life. And you'll have to decide whether you're strong enough to pull the trigger. Capone didn't answer. He didn't need to. The image of Carlo's body slumping forward would stay with him forever, carved into his memory like a scar. As dawn broke over Brooklyn, Frankie finally allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. Not sleep, never sleep, just a brief rest. But even in that moment, his hand stayed close to his pistol. Because in Frankie Yale's world, the only safe sleep was the sleep of the dead. The body of Carlo sank into the black waters of the East River, and with it went the illusion that Brooklyn was untouchable. Frankie Yale had cut out the cancer inside his crew, but the act didn't end his troubles. It only sharpened them. Betrayal had been answered, but the echo of that pistol shot rippled outward, carried by whispers and fear. Within days, Manhattan knew what had happened. Salvatore D'Aquila would not take it quietly. The week after Carlo's execution was one of constant tension. Frankie felt it everywhere, in the way his men glanced at each other, in the nervous silence that hung in the Harvard Inn, in the jittery hands of drivers who gripped their steering wheels a little too tight. Fear was contagious, and Brooklyn was catching it fast. Frankie himself never let it show. He still walked through his club with his head high, his suit pressed, his voice calm. But the nights weighed heavier on him now. He lay awake in his bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, listening for footsteps outside his door. Sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford. Every creak of the floorboards, every car backfiring in the street sounded like the start of his end. Capone, meanwhile, was changing. The boy who once followed Frankie like a shadow now moved with a confidence of his own. The Carlo execution had carved something into him, stripped away the last traces of innocence. He no longer flinched at blood, no longer hesitated when ordered to act. Frankie had given him lessons. Manhattan gave him enemies to practice on. The first retaliation came on a Thursday night. One of Frankie's speakeasies on Court Street was raided, not by cops, but by armed men in suits. They stormed in with pistols and shotguns, tearing through the bar like wolves through a pen. Bottles shattered, men screamed, and when it was over, 3 of Frankie's soldiers lay dead among the broken glass. The message was clear. Manhattan was striking back. Frankie stood in the wreckage the next morning, his shoes crunching on glass, the stink of blood and liquor still hanging in the air. Capone stood beside him, fists clenched, jaw tight. "They hit us in our own house," Capone growled. "We can't just sit here." Frankie lit a cigarette, inhaling slow. His face was calm, but his eyes burned. "We don't sit. We don't run. But we don't go blind either. D'Aquila wants me to lash out. He wants Brooklyn burning. That's how he wins." Capone shook his head, anger boiling in his young blood. "Then what? We just wait until they burn every place we own?" Frankie turned to him, his voice sharp. "Patience, kid. War ain't about who shoots first. It's about who shoots last." That night, Frankie called a meeting in the back room of the Harvard Inn. The lights were low, the table long, the men around it tense. Frankie sat at the head, Capone on his right. "They think they can scare us," Frankie said, his voice steady. "They think Brooklyn's soft, but we're not going to shout, we're not going to cry. We're going to bleed them slow. Hit their money, hit their men. Make Manhattan pay for every inch they step into Brooklyn." The men nodded, though some nervously. Frankie could smell their fear, but he also knew fear could be useful. Fear made men cautious. Fear made them listen. Over the next week, Brooklyn struck back. 2 of D'Aquila's gambling houses mysteriously caught fire. A truck full of bootleg whiskey headed for Manhattan vanished into the night. The driver never seen again. A low-level lieutenant of D'Aquila's crew was found in a gutter, his face unrecognizable, a playing card shoved in his pocket with the word Brooklyn scrawled on it. Capone was at the center of much of it. Frankie gave him more responsibility, more men to command. The boy took to it like he was born for it, his fists and his pistol delivering messages louder than words. Men began to whisper his name in Brooklyn. Capone, Yale's dog, Yale's hammer. Frankie watched with pride, but also with caution. The boy's fire burned hot. and hot fires could consume everything if not controlled. Still, for every strike Brooklyn made, Manhattan answered. Another warehouse torched, another speakeasy shot up. A man close to Frankie was dragged from his car in broad daylight and dumped in the street with his throat cut. The war was no longer quiet. Brooklyn and Manhattan were bleeding each other in the open. One evening, Frankie sat alone in his office at the inn, the weight of it pressing down. Maps and ledgers lay spread before him, the smoke from his cigarette curling upward. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion creeping into his bones. For the first time, he felt old, not in his body, but in his soul. Capone entered without knocking, his face flushed, his hands still stained with blood from a fight. "Boss," he said, almost grinning, "we got one of their boys down on 14th Street. Tried to shake one of our trucks, we put him in the ground." Frankie looked at him, studied the excitement in his eyes. He saw himself, years ago, hungry and ruthless. But he also saw danger, the kind of danger that came from a man who enjoyed the blood too much. "You did good," Frankie said quietly. "But remember, this ain't about fun. This ain't about pride. This is about survival. You enjoy it too much, you lose sight of the game. And men who lose sight of the game don't last." Capone's grin faded, and he nodded. "I understand, boss." But Frankie wasn't sure he did. That night, Frankie couldn't sleep. He paced his room, the city quiet outside, every sound amplified in his mind. He thought of Carlo, of Betrayal, of D'Aquila smiling across the river, waiting for the moment Brooklyn cracked. He thought of Capone, of the boy's hunger and what it might mean for the future. At dawn, Frankie finally sat on the edge of his bed, his pistol in his lap. His eyes burned with fatigue, but he refused to close them. He muttered to himself, almost like a prayer. "Sleep is death. Sleep is weakness. I don't sleep, not while they breathe." By morning, another message arrived. One of Frankie's drivers stumbled into the inn, his shirt soaked in blood, his face pale. He collapsed at the door, gasping for breath. "Boss," he croaked. They hit the convoy. 3 trucks, all gone." His head lolled, and he was dead before the words finished leaving his lips. Frankie stood over the body, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. D'Aquila was pushing harder now, bolder, trying to strangle Brooklyn by cutting off its lifeblood. Capone looked at Frankie, fire in his eyes. "Boss, enough waiting. It's time to go to war." Frankie's face was stone, his voice cold. "War's already here, kid. Now we show 'em what Brooklyn does when it don't sleep." They came for the heart of Manhattan at dawn, quiet as vultures, precise as surgeons. Frankie had planned the strikes for days, fingers tracing lines on maps while he slept with one eye open and the other hand never far from his pistol. He wanted to hurt D'Aquila where it bled, the joints that fed his cash flow, the men who wore his face in the streets, the pride that kept him strutting like a peacock. If D'Aquila wanted a war, Frankie would give him one measured and merciless, a lesson in economy. Take enough to break him, but not so much that Brooklyn burned with him. The first hit was surgical. 2 of D'Aquila's warehouses in lower Manhattan, storerooms for stolen furs and gambling receipts, were stripped overnight. Men posing as dock workers in plain clothes moved silently, loaded crates into unmarked trucks, and left behind nothing but splinters and the faint smell of coal dust. The next morning, D'Aquila woke up with empty ledgers and a thinned payroll. Anger flared. Cursing echoed in his office, but he did not yet know where to aim. Frankie, watching the sun push across Brooklyn from his office window, let the news bounce off him like rain. He lit a cigarette, watched the smoke curl, and thought of the boys he trusted. Capone was the muscle he'd sharpened and tested. Capone was also the blade he could put where need required. Frankie assigned him the job that would take the most nerve, not just to steal, but to take a name and make it mean something. "You're taking Marconi's place," Frankie told him quietly one night, pushing a thick envelope across the table. Inside were photographs, addresses, and a layout of a gambling house near Mulberry Street. "Marconi's crew is D'Aquila's eyes here. You take them down, you'll make a lot of enemies. You'll also make a name." Capone's mouth cracked into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll take it, boss." "You'll be precise," Frankie said. "No showboating. The job is to hurt them." Not to get the whole city after us. Capone nodded. In the map of Frankie's empire, nerves and muscles had to coordinate. Frankie relied on men who could bleed without causing a panic that would draw the law too close. Capone's job required finesse as much as force. Get in, get the money, get out. Kill only if you must. But Frankie knew the boy enough to know what would happen if must arrived. The night of the strike, Capone and a hand-picked group slipped through Manhattan like ghosts. They were not the flashy kind of gang that swaggered in with brass and bluster. These were workmen, each with a job and a place. They entered through a back alley, slid a window, and moved through the belly of the building. The room was heavy with the smell of stale smoke and men who had forgotten to fear anything but boredom. The Capone on duty, a small-time thug who liked to flirt with danger, saw Capone and laughed, thinking it a street show. He didn't laugh long. Capone moved like a shadow with intent. The first shot was soft, cruel, efficient. Men toppled, the air filled with the metallic tang of blood and the rattle of dice. Capone's hand was steady. The boys he moved with him were steady. Within 20 minutes, the safe sat open and thick with money. The betting slips gone, and not a single gutter cop had shown up yet. They left messages for D'Aquila that would sting in the morning. On the door was painted an eye with Brooklyn written beneath it. On the table where the Capo regime had fallen, they left a single playing card, an ace of spades wrapped in a note. You were warned. Capone smiled in the dark as they rolled away. He had done the thing he'd been told to do. He had looked into a man's face at the moment when death came and not flinched. That image burned a brand into him that he would carry for the rest of his life. Manhattan answered back with a fury that smelled of desperation. Frankie watched the escalations like a man watching the temperature rise in a pot of boiling oil. D'Aquila struck at small faces, men delivering parcels, bartenders at speakeasies, a cousin who ran a corner newsstand. He tried to make Frankie bleed in ways that would drive him to make mistakes. Frankie didn't fall for the bait. He moved silent and heavy, hitting back where it would hurt most. He cut D'Aquila's collection routes, swept up his protection racks, and burned a couple of men who'd decided to be independent. Capone's reputation began to grow. Stories moved faster than the truth, as they always do in the city. One night, a messenger came to the inn reporting a broken jaw, a sequence of men being taught to forget whose name they shouted in the dark. Word traveled that Capone was unhinged in the best possible way. He was precise, he was brutal. He did not leave a trail of screaming mothers behind him because, for Frankie, the business of killing needed silence, not spectacle. But other stories found their way out of the shadows too. Stories told by survivors who had seen Capone's face glow like a torchlight in the dark and decided not to cross Brooklyn's line. One afternoon, a man with a face as smooth as milk and a voice like an open pocketbook walked into the inn. He introduced himself as an envoy from a bootlegger in Queens, actually a man sent by D'Aquila, slick and smiling, who meant to test Frankie's temper. He carried a satchel of counterfeit coins and a thin grin, and started in with the kind of talk that got people killed in the right company. Frankie heard him out. He listened to the lilt in the man's voice, the way his eyes flicked to exits and windows. He made jokes, accepted a drink, all the while his mind calculating. He let the envoy leave with a handshake and a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. The man walked into the summer sunlight and into a waiting car 2 blocks away. Capone watched him go, then watched the car. Frankie watched Capone watching. He learned from the way the boy's jaw tightened. "What do you want me to do?" Capone asked later in the privacy of Frankie's office. "You take his boys," Frankie said. "You take the car, you take the coin, and you bring me the envoy's head." Capone blinked, then laughed a quiet laugh. "You don't ask for much," Frankie shrugged. "I ask what will make the other man hesitate." Capone's team moved like an orchestra. They shadowed the envoy to a safe house, noted his schedule, his habits, the name of the bartender he liked. They cut the phone lines, struck when his bodyguard was sick. The envoy went from being a man to being prey in the space of days. Capone found him in a hotel room where men go to forget the world outside. No screaming, no show. A quiet knock, A quick silence. Capone took a cigarette from the envoy's mouth and watched the life leave it. He left the man in his bed like a bad joke. No fanfare, just a warning wrapped in quiet cruelty. The hits kept coming, each one carefully placed so that D'Aquila would wonder, fear, and second guess. That was Frankie's genius. Wear a man down with doubt before the blade found him. A leader who cannot trust his lieutenants is a leader doomed to eat suspicion. Frankie's strikes made D'Aquila look over his shoulder at men he'd trusted. Men began to whisper about traitors. The paranoia in Manhattan grew like mildew. In the middle of this, Frankie received a terrible private blow. One of his oldest friends, a man who had been with him since the docks, old Salvatore, failed in an assignment, and a man he'd let live walked into a police raid. Frankie learned later that Salvatore had taken a bribe from a man he thought he could handle. The guilt in Salvatore's eyes when Frankie found him was thick enough to choke. Frankie could have shot him in the street. Instead, he dragged him into his office, sat him down across from his own face, and watched. "You chose a coin over the crew," Frankie told him without shouting. Salvatore's hands shook. I thought I could split it, Frankie. I thought I could do both." "You thought wrong," Frankie said. He didn't kill Salvatore then. He made him watch friends of his taken one by one to the river. He made Salvatore sign each man's name with his own hand, on a ledger he never saw again. He made him understand that in this world, a single compromise was a gateway. Salvatore's wails filled the inn for days. Frankie let them go on because the lesson had to be carved into the bones. Salvatore left a hollow man, his skin loose over his face, his swagger gone. He was a living warning, which was, Frankie believed, sometimes worse than a corpse. Capone watched all of this, his appetite growing. He had tasted blood and money, and now he was being fed strategy. Where to cut, how deep, and how to wound without showing the scars. The boy, whose full name was Al Capone, began to think of himself less as a student and more as a weapon. The men in the neighborhood started to carry his legend like a shield, and Frankie watched the change with equal parts satisfaction and dread. "Don't let the stories make you feel bigger than you are," Frankie told him one night as they walked the docks. The tide hit the pilings with a steady slap. "A man who thinks he's bigger than his boss is an accident waiting to happen." Capone nodded, but the nod was different now, less deferential, more confident. He was learning to wield fear the way Frankie did. He had learned that sometimes a single shot, done right, could silence rivalries for months. He had learned that a message left on a door could speak louder than an entire sermon. And he had learned to enjoy the control that came with making a man's knees weak. The war escalated into winter. Snow fell thick on the black streets, dulling the sound and softening the city's edges. Yet the violence cut through the hush like a saw. Manhattan, desperate and bleeding, took a gamble that was characteristic of frightened men. They brought in outside muscle. Men from the Bronx, slick with new money and old grudges, rolled into Brooklyn for pay, and they moved ruthless, thinking the game had just begun. One night, at a neutral saloon, a meeting was supposed to be held, an attempt at truce by a man with more ambition than sense. Frankie agreed, but only to watch. He wanted to see the faces of those who would try to bargain with him. Capone went with him, silent and observant. The saloon smelled of cheap cigars and wet coats. D'Aquila sat across from Frankie, his face paper-thin with strain. They talked like men who were playing chess with live pieces. The talk had the feel of diplomacy, but the eyes showed the knives they kept behind their smiles. "You hurt my men," D'Aquila said, drinking slow, his voice smooth as syrup. "You started removing my men," Frankie answered, the same flatness in his tone. "You came into my streets. You had a traitor," D'Aquila said. "You had the courage to check your own," Frankie said. The words circled and men drank. Neither man wanted an all-out war on the city, but both were pushed to the edge. When the meeting ended, both men left with their men, and the saloon emptied into the night. Outside, a car waited. Capone and Frankie stepped into the chill. Capone felt the adrenaline roll through him like hot water. He was ready to move, to strike, to remind the world who ran the docks. Frankie, for all his outward composure, felt the teeth of tiredness in his bones. Winter pulled at him, and the sleepless nights had started to look like a slow claim on him. Yet he kept moving. Sleep was not for men with power to lose. Manhattan never yielded. They struck again. This time, they hit close to home. A low-level lieutenant who'd been good with numbers and loyal to Frankie was found in front of his wife's boarding room, his throat cut. The wife's screams rose like a siren through the neighborhood. Kids peered out from behind curtains. The city felt smaller and meaner, the air colder by a degree that had nothing to do with the weather. That night, Frankie sat at his window and watched the snow swallow the streets. Capone came to stand at his shoulder. The boy's breath steamed in the cold. For a moment, Frankie's face softened, not in sentiment, but in the way a man might study a weapon he knows will be used again. "They'll come for your head if you sit still," Capone said. "They can't keep up with us." Frankie let out a single dry laugh. "They'll come whether I sit or not. The work is never done." Capone looked at him then, the city reflected in his dark eyes. "Boss, what happens when all the men are dead? When all the men who back both of us are gone?" Frankie turned, the exhaustion in his face, lines deepening. "Then the city dies, kid. Then all that's left are the bones." He paused. "You don't think about that. Not now. You think about the next job, the next ledger, the next strike." Capone hesitated, then nodded. He had learned to follow the hand that guided him. He had learned to hide the questions that might make him weak. The war ground on. Men were killed, ledgers emptied, reputations remade. Capone's name whispered through the neighborhoods like a threat. D'Aquila grew meaner, more dangerous, introducing weapons and men that smelled of iron and spendable blood. Frankie felt the net tighten and the city's sleep disappear entirely. Men on both sides began to live like nocturnal animals, moving under cover, communicating in brief coded gestures. In the end, that was what Frankie had always been, nocturnal by design. He hunted at night because night hid the smallest motions of men. Now he taught a student to do the same, to move like a shadow and strike like winter. It changed Capone. It changed Frankie too, though he would never say it. They fed on the city's fear, on its commerce, on its people's need for protection and vice. For every victory, there was a cost. A family grieving on a stoop, a wife who couldn't sleep, a kid who grew up a little harder. When the next message from Manhattan came, it was a single, crude thing. An envelope containing a photograph of Capone, taken by a man who thought himself clever, and a note with a time and a place, an invitation to a meeting in a factory on the Brooklyn side of the river. D'Aquila was getting reckless. He wanted to see Capone's face before he broke it. He wanted to show Brooklyn who still had reach. Frankie held the photo and the note between his fingers and studied the grain of the paper. He watched Capone as the boy's gaze hardened. There was a hunger there that frightened as much as it pleased him. He slid the photograph across the desk. "You go," he said simply. Capone swallowed and picked up the photo. "I will." "You don't go alone," Frankie added. "You go with the boys and you go ready. You know how to do this." Capone grinned, a flash of teeth in the dim light. "I know." Frankie watched the boy leave and felt something small and sharp inside him, pride mixed with an odd, sudden loneliness. Training a man to be your successor was supposed to be a route to immortality. Instead, it felt like sharpening the stick that might one day be used against you. He shrugged it away, the way a man shakes a nagging fly from his sleeve. There was more to do, more men to move, more ledgers to balance. As Capone prepared, Frankie arranged his chessboard with the meticulous hand of a general. The next move would be decisive enough to push D'Aquila back, but not so vast that it would invite the entire city's law down upon them. War had rules, and Frankie, cold, calculating, sleepless, had always been a better student of them than most. When the time came, Capone walked into the factory like a man who owned the night. Men would speak of how he moved for years after, how a vague smile turned into a cold thing when the work began. The factory doors closed behind him, and seconds later, the city felt a little thinner, as if something heavy had been lifted and something darker had settled in its place. The strike was brutal, clean, and absolute. Capone left a message that was harder to ignore than any ledger. A man's skull cracked like an egg in the gutter. A watch stolen and handed back with a note, Brooklyn remembers. Men in Manhattan stopped walking with their heads up. Frankie smiled when the news reached him. It was the smile of a man satisfied with a job done right. Not proud, not smug. Just pleased that the mechanism he'd built still operated as intended. He took another cigarette, inhaled slowly, and watched the smoke disappear into the night. Capone was making a name. The city slept less than before. Brooklyn was winning, for now, but every victory stacked on previous wounds. Frankie felt the city's pulse quicken and the cold in his bones grow heavier. He had taught his boy to be ruthless, too well perhaps. He had taught him to take pride in the consequences of violence. The student was learning the teacher's craft. The teacher knew, with a clarity that did not bring comfort, that the craft would one day be used without him in the room. For now, they were kings of a world that moved by gunshot and ledger. They were architects of fear, and fear had become their currency. Frankie Yale watched from his window. The city sprawled below, and felt the tiredness press like a weight. He did not sleep. He never truly did. But sometimes, in the low hours before dawn, he allowed his eyes to close for a breath. Even kings need a pause. Even kings could be surprised. Outside, the snow muffled the street. In the distance, a train blew its horn. Capone's name would grow, and with every whispered syllable, the world tilted a fraction more on its axis. War had a rhythm, and Frankie had learned to listen. Tonight, the rhythm favored Brooklyn. The men in the city moved like players in his design, and for the first time in weeks, Frankie allowed himself the thought that perhaps, just perhaps, they had steadied the ship. But the town did not sleep. And to sleep in, Frankie knew, was the most dangerous thing a man could do. The strike at the factory had been devastating. Capone had turned that invitation into a funeral for De Aquila's men, leaving bodies scattered in blood and shadows. It was a triumph for Brooklyn, a story retold in whispers across speakeasies and alleyways. Triumph in this life was always fleeting. The ink had barely dried on the tale before Manhattan sharpened its knives. 2 nights later, Brooklyn bled. It began with a fire. A speakeasy on Atlantic Avenue, one of Frankie's more profitable establishments, went up in flames. Witnesses said men in long coats tossed bottles of fuel, lit rags, and walked away while the place screamed with music and laughter inside. By the time Frankie's men arrived, the building was an inferno. 17 people, customers, workers, and a couple of Frankie's soldiers, never made it out. Frankie arrived in time to see the roof cave in. The fire painted the sky orange, and the smell of burning flesh clung to the cold night air. Men shouted, women wept, and Frankie stood there, silent, his face carved from stone. Capone at his side clenched his fists until the knuckles cracked. "They're spitting in our faces," Capone growled, his voice shaking with fury. "We can't just watch this, boss. We gotta hit them harder. Right now." Frankie didn't answer at first. His eyes were fixed on the flames, on the way they devoured everything inside. He had seen death in every form, but fire was different. Fire erased men. Fire left nothing but ash and questions. Finally, Frankie spoke, his voice cold as ice. "We'll hit them, but we'll do it clean. We'll do it smart. And we'll make sure they never forget what it costs to touch Brooklyn." That night, Frankie didn't close his eyes. He sat in his office, maps and names laid before him, cigarette smoke thick around his head. He muttered to himself, replaying every detail, every possibility. Who ordered the fire? Who gave the command? D'Aquila, yes, but whose hand actually lit the match? Frankie needed to know. Sleep taunted him, but he resisted. The thought of shutting his eyes filled him with dread. He remembered Carlo, the betrayal that nearly broke them. He remembered Salvatore, the bribe that gutted a job. And now, this fire. Betrayal could come from anywhere. It could come while he slept. And so Frankie refused to rest, staring at the maps until dawn, his bloodshot eyes burning with rage and exhaustion. By morning, his plan was set. The retaliation came swift and merciless. Frankie's men stormed 3 Manhattan gambling houses in a single night. They moved with precision, their faces covered, their guns hot. Each house was cleared, money stolen, dealers executed. Survivors were left with a simple message carved into the walls: Brooklyn doesn't burn. Capone led the charge at one of the houses, a Thompson gun in his hands. The weapon roared like thunder, and men dropped where they stood. Capone didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. His face was hard, his movements exact. The men who followed him whispered afterward that he looked almost happy, as if the chaos fed something inside him. When the smoke cleared, Capone stood among the bodies, chest heaving, a grin pulling at his lips. He looked like a man baptized in violence, and the others around him looked at him with something close to awe. Back in Brooklyn, Frankie listened to the reports. He nodded, satisfied, but he noticed the way his men spoke about Capone. They called him the Hammer, the Butcher, the kid who doesn't miss. Respect was shifting. Frankie was still the Godfather, but whispers were growing. Whispers that his protege was becoming a legend in his own right. That night, Frankie poured himself a drink and sat across from Capone in his office. The boy, no, not a boy anymore, but not yet a man either, sat with his legs spread, his eyes bright with pride. "You did good," Frankie said, his voice calm. "Too good, maybe." Capone frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're making noise," Frankie said. "Noise brings attention. From tequila, from the cops, from everyone. Attention kills faster than bullets." Capone leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Boss, you taught me to never sleep easy, to never let a man think he can walk on me. That's all I'm doing. I'm showing them Brooklyn ain't weak. I'm showing them I ain't weak." Frankie studied him, his face unreadable. "There's a difference between strength and recklessness. Strength keeps you alive. Recklessness digs your grave." Capone didn't back down. "And what about fear? You think Tequila fears quiet? He fears fire. He fears thunder." "That's what I'm giving him." The silence stretched between them. Frankie finally leaned back, exhaling smoke. "You're hungry, kid. That's good. Hunger keeps a man sharp, but hunger unchecked? Hunger eats a man alive." Capone smirked, though the words cut him. "I'm not going to get eaten, boss. I'm going to eat." Frankie let it go. For now, the war rolled on. Manhattan struck, Brooklyn answered. Blood spilled into the gutters, and the city held its breath. The cops, as always, pretended not to see. Their pockets lined by both sides. Judges turned blind eyes. Reporters whispered rumors but never wrote them down. It was a war fought in shadows, but the shadows stretched wider every night. Frankie grew thinner, his face harder, his eyes more sunken. Sleep continued to elude him. He sat for hours in his office, replaying every move, every whisper, every possibility. His men saw it but said nothing. No one questioned Frankie Yale, not openly. But they noticed. The Godfather of Brooklyn was looking older, more tired, even as his legend grew. Capone, on the other hand, seemed to grow stronger. Every fight fed him, every gunshot sharpened him. Men followed him not just because he was Frankie's protege, but because he inspired something Frankie never had, a reckless kind of loyalty born from awe. Capone was fire, where Frankie was ice, and men are always drawn to fire, even if it burns them. One night, while Frankie sat alone in his club, Tony entered, his face pale. "Boss," he said quietly, "you need to see this." He handed Frankie a folded note. Frankie opened it, his hand steady, though his stomach twisted. The note was short, written in a messy scrawl. "We know where you sleep." Frankie stared at the words for a long time. His pulse didn't quicken, his hands didn't shake, but inside, something cold spread through him. Sleep had always been his enemy. Now it was his weakness. His enemies knew it too. He crumpled the note and lit it on fire with his lighter, watching it turn to ash in the ashtray. "Double the guards," he told Tony. "Nobody gets near my house. Nobody." Tony nodded, but Frankie could see the worry in his eyes. Later that night, as Frankie sat alone with his cigarette, Capone entered, his face serious. "I heard about the note," Capone said. "You worried?" Frankie smirked faintly. "Worried? No? Annoyed? Yes? Anybody can write words on paper. Words don't kill, guns do." Capone sat across from him, leaning forward. Then let's kill them before they get close. Let's go right at D'Aquila, right at his house. End this. Frankie shook his head. That's not how it works. You cut off the head, another grows. You want to kill a snake, you bleed it slow, piece by piece. That's how you win. Capone frowned, frustration flashing in his eyes. Maybe, or maybe you just cut the head clean off and be done with it. Frankie studied him for a long moment, then sighed. One day, Capone, you'll understand. The longer you sit in this chair, the more you see. The game isn't about winning quick. It's about surviving long. Capone leaned back, his jaw tight. He didn't agree. But he said nothing. Days later, Manhattan struck again. This time, it wasn't a speakeasy or a warehouse. This time, it was personal. Frankie's brother Angelo was ambushed on his way home. His car was riddled with bullets, his body found slumped over the wheel, blood soaking his suit. When Frankie got the news, he didn't speak. He didn't rage. He didn't weep. He simply sat there, his cigarette burning down to the filter, his eyes empty. Capone, standing nearby, slammed his fist into the wall. That's it, boss. That's it. No more waiting. No more patience. We take them all. Tonight. Frankie finally looked up, his eyes burning with something colder than rage. No, kid, not tonight. We don't run blind. We don't scream. We don't lose control. That's what they want. Capone shook his head, furious. They killed your brother, Frankie. How much more do you need before you hit back? Frankie stood, his voice sharp as steel. Don't tell me how to run my war. You think blood makes you strong? Blood makes you sloppy. My brother's gone. That's pain. But pain isn't weakness. Pain is focus, and I will focus until Manhattan drowns in it. The room went silent. Capone stared at him, chest heaving, but said nothing more. He saw the fury in Frankie's eyes. And he knew, when Frankie struck back this time, it would not be a cut. It would be a massacre. That night, Frankie didn't even attempt to sleep. He sat at his desk until dawn, maps and notes spread around him, his cigarette burning to ash after ash. His men whispered that he was going mad, that the lack of sleep was eating him alive, but no one dared to say it to his face. By morning, his plan was ready. He would hit D'Aquila's convoy, a shipment of liquor coming through the Manhattan docks. It wasn't just about money, it was about pride. He would burn it to the ground, and with it, D'Aquila's reputation. He sent Capone to lead the charge. As the sun set, Capone gathered his men, loaded their guns, and rolled out. Frankie watched from the shadows of his office, his hands folded, his eyes hollow. He didn't pray. He didn't hope. He simply waited. Because in Frankie Yale's world, there was no sleep. Only waiting. Only blood. The convoy rolled through Manhattan's docks just after midnight. 3 trucks heavy with Canadian whiskey, each guarded by a pair of cars front and back. Inside the cabs, men in thick coats sat with Tommy guns across their laps, eyes sharp, jaws tight. They knew Brooklyn had been bleeding them for weeks. They knew Frankie Yale's dogs were out there, waiting. But they also believed in D'Aquila's power and the reach of Manhattan. What they didn't believe in, what they couldn't imagine, was the storm waiting in the shadows. Capone crouched in an alley with a dozen of Frankie's best soldiers, the cold biting their faces, their breaths turning white in the night. He clutched the Thompson gun like it was an extension of his body. His heart wasn't racing, no. His pulse was steady, his eyes bright. For him, this wasn't nerves, this was hunger. He turned to his men, his voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. Remember what the boss said, clean and fast. We don't leave survivors unless they're screaming with our message in their mouths. Tonight, Manhattan learns who owns this city. The men nodded, some grinning, some pale with fear. Capone smirked, then adjusted his hat and waited. The rumble of engines grew louder. The convoy emerged from the fog, headlights glowing like eyes in the dark. The lead car rolled past, tires crunching over cobblestones. Capone raised his hand, waited until the trucks entered the kill zone, then dropped it. The night exploded. Molotovs sailed through the air, smashing against the first truck. Flames erupted, licking across wood and steel. Gunfire cracked like thunder, bullets tearing through metal and flesh. The convoy lurched to a halt, men shouting, scrambling, firing blindly into the shadows. Capone stepped into the open, his Thompson roaring. The gun spat fire, mowing down 2 guards before they could even turn their weapons. He walked forward steadily, each burst precise, each movement calculated. Men fell screaming, blood pooling in the street. "Move! Move!" Capone shouted, his voice fierce, commanding. His men surged forward, swarming the trucks, ripping open the backs, dragging out crates of whiskey. Bullets whined past them, but the ambush had been too sudden, too vicious. The Manhattan guards never stood a chance. One man, bleeding from the chest, tried to crawl away, gasping for air. Capone strode over, kicked him onto his back, and crouched beside him. "Go back to Dequila," Capone said, pressing the muzzle of his gun against the man's forehead. "Tell him Brooklyn doesn't sleep. Tell him I don't sleep." The man opened his mouth to speak, but Capone pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the docks, final and merciless. By the time the shooting stopped, the convoy was rubble. Trucks smoldered, bodies lay twisted in the street, and Brooklyn's men loaded crate after crate into their own vehicles. The ambush had lasted less than 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to those who survived it. Capone stood in the middle of the carnage, chest heaving, smoke curling from his Thompson. His men looked at him not just as Frankie's protege, but as a leader in his own right. He had commanded them, led them, inspired them. He had turned fear into fire. When they returned to Brooklyn, the Harvard Inn erupted in celebration. Whiskey flowed, glasses clinked, laughter filled the air. Men slapped Capone on the back, calling him a king, a butcher, a storm. They raised their glasses to him, their voices loud with pride. Frankie sat in the back, a glass untouched before him. He watched the room, his face unreadable. His men were cheering, but they weren't cheering his name. They were cheering Capone's. Capone noticed too. He grinned, basking in the attention, his confidence swelling. But when he glanced toward Frankie, he saw the older man's expression, calm, silent, but sharp as a blade. For the first time, Capone felt something stir inside him. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The newspapers couldn't ignore it. The next morning, headlines screamed about the bloodbath on the docks. "Bootleggers slaughtered in midnight massacre," one read. Another, "War in the shadows, Brooklyn versus Manhattan." The police commissioner stood before cameras, blustering about law and order, promising swift justice. But everyone in the city knew the truth. The cops were bought, the courts were blind, and justice wore the face of whoever held the most power. Still, the ambush had been too loud, too bloody to sweep away with bribes. Detectives began sniffing around, reporters hounded witnesses, federal agents whispered about getting involved. For the first time, Frankie felt the law's gaze turn heavy on Brooklyn. That night, he called Capone into his office. The boy swaggered in, still glowing from the praise, his grin wide. "Boss," Capone said, "did you see it? Did you hear what they're saying? Manhattan's on its knees. We broke them." Frankie leaned back, his eyes hard. "We made noise, too much noise." Capone frowned. "Noise is what they fear. Noise is what makes them run." Frankie slammed his fist onto the desk, making Capone flinch. "Noise brings the law, kid. You think D'Aquila scares me? He bleeds like any man. But the cops, the feds, they don't bleed, they crush. And you just painted a target on Brooklyn big enough for the whole damn city to see." Capone's grin faded. He leaned forward, defiant. "So what? We hide? We cower? That ain't what you taught me. You taught me never to sleep easy, never to let a man think he's stronger. That's all I did." Frankie's eyes narrowed. "You're learning the wrong lesson. Fear ain't about noise. Fear's about silence. When a man disappears without a trace, that's fear. When his money vanishes, when his friends start looking over their shoulders, that's fear. You make him bleed in the dark, not in the papers." Capone clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. Not openly. Inside, though, he thought Frankie was wrong. The papers made him bigger. The cheers made him stronger. Silence might work for Frankie, but fire worked for him. In the weeks that followed, the city teetered on the edge. Manhattan was reeling, D'Aquila furious, his men whispering about Capone's name more than his own. Brooklyn was rising, its streets alive with confidence. But the law was circling, the press digging, the people growing restless. Frankie felt it pressing on him. His nights grew longer, his eyes darker. He slept less than ever, sitting awake with maps and notes, cigarette after cigarette burning down to ash. He muttered to himself, replaying every move, every whisper, every possibility. His men began to whisper too, that their boss was unraveling, that sleeplessness was eating him alive. One night, Tony found him slumped over his desk, his eyes bloodshot, his hand still clutching a half-burned cigarette. "Boss," Tony said softly, "you need rest." Frankie looked up slowly, his gaze hollow. "Rest is death, Tony. You sleep, you give them the knife. I don't sleep." Tony said nothing. He just nodded, but inside, he feared for his boss. Meanwhile, Capone thrived. He drank, he laughed, he commanded. Men followed him eagerly. His legend spreading beyond Brooklyn into Manhattan, Queens, even Chicago. Whispers said he was more dangerous than Frankie, more ruthless, more alive. Some even wondered if one day he'd eclipse the Godfather himself. Capone liked the whispers. He fed on them, but he never let them slip into his words around Frankie. Not yet. Still, Frankie felt it. He felt the shift in the air, the way men looked at Capone, the way they hesitated before looking back at him. He knew what it meant. Power was like smoke, hard to hold, always slipping toward whoever burned hottest. And Frankie Yale, the Godfather of Brooklyn, was burning out. The breaking point came 2 weeks after the convoy ambush. A funeral. One of Frankie's lieutenants gunned down outside a grocery store, his body riddled with holes. The funeral drew hundreds. Family, neighbors, gangsters from every corner. The church was thick with grief, the air heavy with incense. Frankie stood at the front, his face blank, his eyes hollow. Capone stood behind him, jaw tight, his presence radiating strength. Men in the pews whispered, not about the dead, but about the living. About how Frankie looked tired, worn, weak. About how Capone looked strong, alive, unstoppable. After the service, Frankie walked out into the cold air, the crowd parting for him. He lit a cigarette, his hands steady though his soul trembled. Capone joined him, silent. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Frankie exhaled smoke and muttered, "They're watching me, kid. All of them. Waiting. I can see it in their eyes." Capone looked at him, then at the crowd. He smirked faintly. "Let 'em watch. They know who runs this city. They know it's us." Frankie glanced at him, his eyes narrowing. "Us." Capone held his gaze, unflinching. Yeah, us." For the first time, Frankie wondered if the boy he had mentored, the boy he had sharpened into a weapon, was no longer just his student. Maybe Capone wasn't the future. Maybe Capone was already the present, and maybe Frankie Yale, the sleepless king of Brooklyn, was living on borrowed time. The city woke up restless. Newspapers on every corner shouted about gang wars, convoys blown apart, bodies piling in the gutters. For months, the violence had been whispered about, half hidden behind smoky club doors and crooked police reports. But the convoy massacre had changed everything. The blood had been too public, the flames too bright. And when the city couldn't look away, neither could the law. Detectives began swarming the docks. Federal agents sniffed around the warehouses. Prohibition officers, usually easy to bribe, started refusing envelopes and asking questions. Judges, terrified of being seen as weak, ordered raids. The newspapers had whipped the city into a frenzy, and the city demanded action. Frankie Yale sat in the back office of the Harvard Inn, cigarette smoke hanging heavy. The latest headlines spread across his desk. "Blood on the docks. Police promise crackdown." "Who runs Brooklyn? Gangster violence terrorizes city." Yale or D'Aquila? Who is the real boss? Frankie read each one slowly, his eyes narrowing. He didn't care about the words themselves. Newspapers were ink and lies. What mattered was what they stirred. Fear, outrage, and outrage made politicians act. Tony sat across from him, hat in his hands, his face tight. "They're serious this time, boss. They're talking federal charges, interstate bootlegging, tax evasion." Frankie crushed the cigarette into the ashtray, grinding it hard. "Talking ain't doing. They want to scare us, that's all." But even as he said it, he felt the weight pressing down. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if the money could silence everyone. Too many eyes were watching now. The door opened, and Capone strolled in, his grin wide, his suit sharp. He dropped into a chair like he owned the place, grabbing one of the newspapers off the desk. "Look at this, boss," he said, smirking. "They got my name in here now. Al Capone, Yale's lieutenant, rumored to have led the ambush." He slapped the paper down, laughing. "I told you noise works. They fear us now more than ever." Frankie shot him a cold look. "They fear us, yes, but they're also coming for us. You think headlines are a medal, kid? They're a target on your back." Capone shrugged. "Targets don't matter if you can't be touched." Frankie leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Everybody can be touched. Don't forget that." For a moment, the room was tense. Capone's grin faded, replaced by a hard stare. But then he nodded, leaning back, the fire in his eyes undimmed. The raids began that week. Police stormed 2 of Frankie's speakeasies, hauling out bartenders and customers, smashing bottles with clubs. They raided a warehouse in Red Hook, seizing crates of whiskey worth thousands. Frankie's men were arrested, dragged into court, paraded before cameras like trophies. Frankie pulled every string he had. Bribes flowed like water. Envelopes stuffed with cash passed hand to hand. Judges dismissed cases. Cops suddenly lost evidence, but each bribe cost more than the last, and still the raids continued. At night, Frankie paced his office, eyes bloodshot, muttering to himself. Sleep was further from him than ever. He felt the walls closing in, the net tightening. Every sound outside his window made him reach for his pistol. Every shadow felt like an assassin. Tony found him one night, sitting in the dark with a gun in his lap. "Boss," Tony said softly, "you're tearing yourself apart. You need rest." Frankie's eyes flicked up, sharp and cold. "Rest is death. I told you before. I close my eyes, they win. I don't sleep. Not while I'm breathing." Tony wanted to argue, but he knew better. He just nodded and left, worry gnawing at him. Meanwhile, Capone thrived. The raids didn't scare him, they excited him. The papers fed his ego, painting him as Yale's right hand, the young wolf of Brooklyn. His name carried weight now, not just in New York, but beyond. Bootleggers from Chicago, Detroit, even Philadelphia came whispering, wanting to do business with the man who had led the convoy ambush. One night, after a long evening of meetings, Capone lingered in Frankie's office. He poured himself a drink, his movements casual, but his eyes sharp. "Boss," he said, "you ever think about expanding? Brooklyn's strong, sure, but there's more out there. Chicago, for example. They're wide open, hungry. They're asking for someone to take it." Frankie lit a cigarette, his gaze narrowing. "Chicago's a mess. Too many gangs, too many hands in the pot. You go out there, you'll end up dead in a ditch," Capone smirked. "Or I'll end up running the whole damn city." Frankie studied him, exhaling smoke. "You're not ready, not yet. Brooklyn still needs you." Capone shrugged, sipping his drink, but Frankie saw the glint in his eyes. The boy was restless. Ambition burned in him like a fever. Brooklyn wasn't enough anymore. The next blow came from within. One of Frankie's bookkeepers, an older man named Meyer, was arrested during a raid. Normally, it would have been nothing. A bribe, a lawyer, and the man would walk free. But this time, the feds leaned on him hard. Tax charges, threats of prison. They dangled his family in front of him like bait. And Meyer broke. He began talking. When Frankie got word, he went cold. A rat in his books meant more than betrayal. It meant exposure. The numbers could bury him, prove the empire he'd built. Frankie ordered Meyer brought to him. The man arrived trembling, escorted by Tony and Capone. He looked small, pathetic, sweat soaking his collar. Frankie, please, Meyer begged, his voice shaking. They had me cornered. I had no choice. I'll make it right, I swear. Frankie stared at him, silent, his face carved from stone. Finally he spoke, his voice low. No choice? There's always a choice. You chose yourself over me. You chose yourself over Brooklyn. Meyer sobbed. Please, Frankie, I've known you for years. I've been loyal. Loyalty doesn't break, Frankie cut in. He looked at Capone. Do it. Capone grinned faintly, stepped forward, and drew his pistol. Meyer's pleas turned into screams, but they ended with a single shot. The man crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. Frankie didn't flinch. He just nodded. Burn the books. Move the money. We tighten everything. Capone looked at him, his grin lingering. You see, boss, fear works. Frankie met his eyes, the shadows deep under his own. Fear works, but fear also grows. One day it grows too big to hold. The war with Manhattan slowed, but it didn't end. D'Aquila had been weakened, humiliated, but he wasn't finished. His men still lurked in the shadows, waiting, plotting. Frankie knew the fight wasn't over, but the bigger threat now wasn't Manhattan. It was the law, and the law didn't sleep. Every day brought new headlines, new raids, new whispers. The feds wanted a trophy, and Frankie's name was on their list. He had dodged them before, but the net was closing. He could feel it in his bones. Capone, though, seemed untouchable. The law barely knew his name. He was young, bold, slippery, and with every move, his legend grew. Chicago kept calling, louder and louder. One night, Frankie sat alone in his office, cigarette smoke curling around him, maps and ledgers spread before him. His hands trembled slightly, though he tried to steady them. His eyes burned from sleeplessness. Capone entered, his grin easy, his energy sharp. He poured himself a drink, then looked at Frankie. You look tired, boss. Frankie smirked faintly, though his eyes were hollow. I've been tired for years. Capone raised his glass. Maybe it's time to rest. Frankie's gaze snapped to him, sharp. Rest is death. Don't forget that. Capone smirked, sipping his drink. Maybe, or maybe rest is just passing the torch. The silence between them was heavy, electric. Frankie stared at him, searching his face. He saw the hunger there, the ambition. The boy he had mentored was no longer a boy. He was a wolf, teeth bared, ready to bite. Frankie leaned back, exhaling smoke. Brooklyn's mine. Don't ever forget that. Capone smiled faintly, his eyes burning. For now, boss. For now. That night, Frankie didn't sleep. He sat at his desk until dawn, cigarette after cigarette burning down to ash. His body ached, his mind fogged, but he refused to close his eyes. Because he knew. The law was coming. Manhattan was waiting. And Capone, his student, his hammer, his fire, was no longer just looking at him with loyalty. He was looking at him with hunger. And Frankie Yale, the godfather of Brooklyn, was beginning to realize that his greatest creation might also be his greatest threat. The cold winter air cut through Brooklyn like a knife. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops, but the streets were alive with tension. Cops on corners, reporters scribbling in notebooks, federal agents lurking like sharks. The convoy ambush had made too much noise. Now the city demanded action, and the government was eager to deliver. Frankie Yale's empire, built on fear and silence, was suddenly wide open under the spotlight. The raids grew bolder. Federal agents stormed another of his warehouses, this time seizing not just liquor, but ledgers. Ledgers that Frankie had thought were safe, hidden behind bribes and loyal bookkeepers. They paraded the crates down the street for cameras, a display meant to humiliate him. Frankie sat in his office at the Harvard Inn, the latest newspaper headline spread before him. Brooklyn Godfather on the run, Yale Empire under siege. He stared at the words, his jaw clenched, cigarette smoke curling around him. Across the desk sat Tony, hat in his hands, his voice low. They've got names now, boss. Roots, numbers. If those ledgers hold up in court... Frankie cut him off, his tone sharp as a blade. They won't. Judges can be bought. Evidence can disappear. Tony hesitated. But the feds, they ain't like the cops. They don't take bribes the same way. Frankie's eyes snapped up, burning. Everybody takes bribes. You just haven't found the right number yet. But even as he said it, doubt crept into him. For the first time in years, money didn't feel like enough. The door opened, and Capone walked in, his grin wide, his energy electric. He dropped into a chair, picked up the paper, and laughed. "They're writing about you like you're already dead," Capone said, smirking. "And look, my name's in here again. Lieutenant Al Capone, said to be Yale's rising star." Rising star, Frankie. Can you believe it? Frankie glared at him. "You think this is funny?" Capone shrugged. "I think it means we're winning. They're scared. They wouldn't print our names if they weren't." Frankie leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "Scared? Kid, scared men don't write. Scared men shoot. And right now, everyone's got their guns pointed at us." Capone just grinned, sipping from Frankie's untouched glass of whiskey. "So let 'em point. They can't stop us. Not you, not me." That night, Frankie didn't close his eyes. He sat at his desk until dawn, cigarette after cigarette burning down to nothing. He muttered to himself, replaying every detail, every possibility. His hands trembled as he shuffled papers, his mind fogging from exhaustion. Tony checked on him in the early hours, finding him still awake, his face pale and hollow. "Boss," Tony said softly, "you're killing yourself. You need sleep." Frankie's eyes snapped to him, bloodshot, wild. "Sleep is death, Tony. You don't get it. You close your eyes and they're there, with the knife, with the gun, waiting. I don't sleep." Tony swallowed hard, nodding. He knew better than to argue, but in his gut he felt fear, not for the enemies outside, but for the man inside this office, unraveling before his eyes. The next blow came swift and merciless. One of Frankie's trucks, carrying a shipment worth thousands, was intercepted not by Manhattan, but by federal agents. The drivers were arrested, the liquor seized, and for the first time, the feds didn't just take the product, they followed the trail. Warrants were issued, men were questioned. Frankie's name was whispered in courtrooms, his empire dissected in secret meetings. The feds weren't just trying to stop him, they were trying to bury him. Frankie responded with rage. He called his lieutenants into the inn, his voice sharp, his hands trembling as he pointed at maps and ledgers. "We tighten everything. No more mistakes. No more leaks. If anyone even breathes to the wrong man, I want him in the river by morning." The men nodded, though some hesitated. Frankie noticed. His paranoia sharpened. He began watching them closer, testing them with small lies to see who repeated them. Every look, every pause, every whisper felt like betrayal. Capone, meanwhile, seemed untouchable. The feds didn't know his name the way they knew Frankie's. He moved freely, cutting deals, making connections. Chicago bootleggers began calling for him directly, skipping Frankie's name altogether. One night, Capone walked into Frankie's office with a letter in his hand. He tossed it onto the desk. "Chicago," he said, grinning. "They want me out there. They're offering territory, big money. They say the city's wide open." Frankie picked up the letter, his hands steady though his stomach twisted. He read the words slowly, then set it down. "You're not going," he said flatly. Capone raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because Brooklyn still needs you," Frankie said, his tone sharp. "You're my man. You don't walk out on me." Capone smirked. "I'm your man, sure. But I'm also my own man. Chicago's calling, Frankie, and I can't ignore it forever." The silence between them was heavy, electric. Frankie's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. Capone leaned back, smirking. But the grin didn't reach his eyes. For the first time, Frankie felt it clearly. The student was no longer content to be the student. The feds struck again days later, this time raiding Frankie's own house. It was dawn when they kicked in the door, storming through with badges and shotguns. Lucy screamed as agents tore through drawers, ripping up floorboards, searching for ledgers and cash. Frankie stood in the middle of it, calm, smoking a cigarette, watching with cold eyes as they ransacked his life. "Mr. Yale," one agent sneered, holding up a stack of papers. "Looks like we've got you this time." Frankie smirked faintly. "Looks like you've got nothing but paper, boy. Paper burns." The agent glared at him, but Frankie didn't flinch. Inside, though, rage burned. They had invaded his sanctuary, his home. No amount of bribes could erase the humiliation. When the agents finally left, Lucy wept, the house in ruins. Frankie lit another cigarette, his face blank. "Frankie," she sobbed, "this isn't life. You can't go on like this." He didn't look at her. "This is the only life there is." That night, Frankie sat alone in his office, the papers from the raid spread before him. His hands trembled as he lit another cigarette. He muttered to himself, replaying every move, every whisper, every possibility. Capone entered quietly, pouring himself a drink, watching him. "You look tired, boss," Capone said softly. Frankie smirked faintly, though his eyes were hollow. "I've been tired for years." Capone sipped his drink, studying him. "Maybe it's time to let someone else carry the weight, just for a while." Frankie's gaze snapped up, sharp. "You talking about yourself?" Capone grinned. "Maybe, maybe not. I'm just saying. Even kings need rest." Frankie leaned back, exhaling smoke. "Rest is death, and I don't plan on dying yet." But deep inside, he felt it. The weight pressing heavier every day, the walls closing in, the law circling tighter. And Capone, his student, his hammer, his fire, looking at him not with loyalty anymore, but with hunger. The city whispered louder now. They whispered that Frankie Yale was slipping, that he was paranoid, sleepless, unraveling, that his empire was cracking under the weight of raids and indictments, and they whispered that Al Capone, the butcher of the convoy, the storm of Brooklyn, was the future. That Chicago was calling his name, and when he went, he would become bigger than Brooklyn, bigger than Frankie, bigger than anyone. Frankie heard the whispers. He sat alone in his office, cigarette smoke curling, eyes bloodshot, muttering to himself. He knew the truth. The law was closing in. Manhattan was waiting, and his own protege was growing into a wolf too hungry to stay in his shadow. Frankie Yale, the Godfather of Brooklyn, didn't sleep. He couldn't. Because sleep was death, and he could feel death breathing down his neck. The Harvard Inn no longer felt like Frankie's kingdom. Once, its walls had echoed with laughter, music, and whispered deals. Now it was quiet, tense, filled with the nervous glances of men who once worshipped their boss, but now wondered how much longer he could hold the throne. Frankie Yale sat in the back room, his pistol resting on the table, his eyes bloodshot from nights without sleep. The smoke from his cigarette curled upward, but his gaze never left the faces of the men gathered before him. "You think I don't hear the whispers?" he said, his voice low but sharp. "You think I don't know some of you are talking to the feds, talking to D'Aquila? Don't play me for a fool." The men shifted in their seats, some muttering denials, others staring at the floor. Frankie scanned them one by one, his finger tapping the pistol on the table. Finally, his eyes landed on Vincenzo, a soldier who'd been with him for years. Frankie narrowed his gaze. "You," he said coldly, "stand up." Vincenzo froze, then slowly rose to his feet, his face pale. "Boss, I swear." Before he could finish, Frankie raised the pistol and shot him in the chest. The blast echoed through the room, men flinching, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. Vincenzo staggered, gasped, then collapsed to the floor, blood spreading across the wood. Frankie stood slowly, his voice calm. "That's what happens to traitors. Anyone else thinking of running their mouths, remember Vincenzo." The room was silent, the men pale with fear. Frankie sat back down, lit another cigarette, and exhaled smoke. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. Fear was the only loyalty left. Capone was there, leaning against the wall, watching. His face was calm, but inside, he felt the shift. Frankie wasn't ruling with respect anymore. He was ruling with paranoia, and paranoia didn't last. Later, as the room emptied, Capone lingered. He walked up to Frankie, his voice low. "You didn't even know for sure, did you?" Frankie glanced at him, his eyes hollow. "Doesn't matter. If he wasn't a rat today, he would have been tomorrow. Better to cut the snake before it bites." Capone smirked faintly, though there was no humor in his eyes. "You're making enemies faster than D'Aquila ever could." Frankie leaned forward, his voice sharp. Don't forget yourself, kid. I built this. Without me, you're just another punk with a gun. Capone held his gaze, unflinching. Maybe? Or maybe I'm the one keeping this place from falling apart. The silence between them was thick, dangerous. For the first time, Frankie felt it clearly. The boy he'd mentored wasn't afraid of him anymore. The feds struck again the following week. Another raid, this time on a warehouse Frankie had thought was untouchable. They seized thousands of dollars worth of liquor, arrested half a dozen of his men, and announced indictments were being prepared against Frankie himself. The newspapers screamed the headlines, "Yale to face federal charges, Brooklyn Empire crumbling." Frankie read the words slowly, his jaw clenched. He crushed the paper into a ball, tossed it into the ashtray, and lit it on fire. "Let them come," he muttered to himself. "Let them all come." But inside, fear gnawed at him. Not fear of prison, he'd escaped charges before. Fear of weakness, fear of losing the respect that had kept men loyal. Fear that the empire he'd built, the empire he'd bled for, was slipping through his fingers. Capone, meanwhile, was thriving. The raids barely touched him. The feds didn't know his name the way they knew Frankie's. He moved freely, meeting with bootleggers from other cities, cutting deals, building connections. Chicago's name came up more and more. They wanted him. They needed him. One night, Capone brought it up directly. "Boss," he said, pouring himself a drink in Frankie's office, "Chicago's wide open. They're begging for someone to take it. I could make us millions out there." Frankie glared at him. "Brooklyn's enough," Capone smirked. "Brooklyn's small. Chicago's a kingdom. You should see the way they talk about me out there. Like I'm already one of them." Frankie leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You're not going. Not while I'm breathing." Capone's grin faded. He set the glass down, his eyes burning. "What if Brooklyn ain't enough for me anymore?" The silence stretched, heavy as stone. Frankie's jaw tightened, his hand resting on the pistol beside him. Capone didn't flinch. For the first time, Frankie wondered if his protege wasn't just thinking about leaving, but about replacing him. The paranoia grew worse. Frankie began suspecting everyone, lieutenants, soldiers, even old friends. He set traps, feeding false information to see who leaked it. When raids followed, he had men dragged into alleys and shot. The Harvard Inn became a place of fear. Men whispered that walking into the back room was like stepping into your own grave. Frankie's sleeplessness showed on his face, hollow cheeks, bloodshot eyes, trembling hands. But his mind was sharp, sharper than ever, cutting through lies with precision. One night, he caught another rat, a driver who'd been feeding the feds information. Frankie had him brought into the office, tied to a chair. He circled the man slowly, smoking, his voice calm. "You thought you were smart," Frankie said softly. "You thought you could sell me out and walk away, but you forgot one thing." The driver trembled, sweat pouring down his face. "Please, boss, Frankie cut him off, pressing the barrel of his pistol against the man's forehead. "Nobody walks away from me, not alive." The shot echoed, blood splattering the floor. Frankie lit another cigarette, exhaling smoke as the body slumped. Capone watched from the corner, his face unreadable. He felt no pity for the rat, but he saw what Frankie was becoming. A man who killed not for survival, but for fear. By spring, the feds were closing in. Indictments loomed. Manhattan whispered that Frankie was finished. Even his own men began looking elsewhere, some toward D'Aquila, some toward Capone. Capone knew it. He could feel the shift in the air. Chicago's offers grew louder, more tempting. And every time he looked at Frankie, hollow-eyed, sleepless, clutching his pistol like a lifeline, he wondered if it was time to leave. One night, he sat across from Frankie, their drinks untouched between them. "Boss," Capone said quietly, "you can't fight everyone. The feds, Manhattan, even your own men. It's too much." Frankie smirked faintly, though his eyes were dead. "I've been fighting everyone my whole life. That's how I got here." Capone leaned forward. "And where is here, Frankie? Look at yourself. You're bleeding, you're tired, you don't sleep. This ain't strength anymore, it's madness." Frankie's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a knife. "Careful, kid." Capone didn't back down. "I'm just saying, maybe it's time to let go. Maybe it's time to rest." Frankie exhaled smoke, his face unreadable. Rest is death, and I don't plan on dying yet. But deep inside, he felt it. The walls closing in, the law circling, his empire crumbling, and his protege, his own creation, looking at him not with loyalty anymore, but with hunger. Brooklyn whispered louder now. It whispered that Frankie Yale was unraveling, that his sleepless nights had made him paranoid, violent, dangerous even to his own men, that his empire was cracking piece by piece, and they whispered that Al Capone was the future, that Chicago was calling his name, that he was bigger than Brooklyn, bigger than Frankie, bigger than anyone. Frankie heard the whispers. He sat alone in his office, cigarette smoke curling, eyes hollow, muttering to himself. The feds were coming. Manhattan was waiting, and his protege, his hammer, his fire, was no longer standing beside him. He was standing in front of him. And Frankie Yale, the sleepless king of Brooklyn, knew the truth he had spent years denying. Every king falls. The walls of Brooklyn seemed closer now, as if the whole borough was shrinking around Frankie Yale. The Harvard Inn, once a temple to his power, had become a cage of whispers. His men no longer laughed in the halls or clinked glasses with easy loyalty. Their voices were hushed, their eyes darting, their hands twitching toward their coats whenever Frankie's name was spoken. Fear had always been the mortar of his empire, but fear was different now. It wasn't just fear of Frankie or of Manhattan or of the cops. It was fear of everything. Fear that the law would kick down the door at any moment. Fear that Frankie would point his pistol at the wrong man. Fear that the empire itself was rotting. Frankie felt it, saw it in the way his men walked, in the way they looked at Capone. The boy was no longer just his protege. He was their safety net, their future. And Frankie could feel himself fading into something less than immortal. The summons came on a Tuesday morning. Federal marshals arrived at the Harvard Inn in broad daylight, striding past the doormen with their badges gleaming. Frankie was in his office, cigarette burning low, when they pushed the door open. "Frankie Yale," one of them said flatly, "you're being served. Federal tax evasion, racketeering, bootlegging across state lines." Frankie leaned back in his chair, smirking faintly. "Took you long enough?" The marshal dropped a thick envelope onto the desk. "You'll be in court within the month. Don't think your money's going to save you this time." Frankie's smirk didn't fade, but his hand trembled slightly as he stubbed out the cigarette. He waited until the marshals left before opening the envelope. Inside were pages of names, dates, numbers, all the things he had worked so hard to bury. Tony entered minutes later, his face pale. "Boss?" Frankie handed him the papers, his voice flat. "They think they got me. They think paper can kill me." Tony flipped through the documents, his hands shaking. "They've got everything, boss. If this sticks..." "It won't stick," Frankie snapped. "Judges can be bought. Papers can burn." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. The feds weren't the local cops. They weren't drunks with empty pockets. They were wolves with the law behind them, and they wouldn't stop until they sank their teeth into his throat. That night, Frankie called a meeting. His lieutenants gathered in the back room, their faces tense, the air thick with smoke. Capone sat among them, calm, almost amused, sipping whiskey as if this were just another game. Frankie stood at the head of the table, the summons papers in his hand. "They think they can bury me," he said coldly. "They think paper is stronger than blood. But we don't fold. We don't bend. We tighten the circle, we cut out the rats, and we remind this city who owns it." Some men nodded, their loyalty still strong. Others hesitated, their eyes flicking toward Capone. Frankie noticed. He always noticed. After the meeting, as the room emptied, Frankie pulled Capone aside. "You think this is funny?" he asked quietly. Capone smirked. "I think it's noise. The feds like their headlines, but headlines don't pull triggers." Frankie's eyes narrowed. "Headlines put men in cells. Don't forget that." Capone leaned closer, his voice low. "And what if a cell ain't the worst thing? What if Chicago's offering freedom instead?" Frankie froze, his jaw tightening. "You're not going anywhere," Capone grinned faintly. "You can't hold me here forever, boss." The silence between them was heavy, dangerous. Frankie saw it in his eyes. the hunger, the ambition. The boy wasn't asking permission anymore. He was making promises. The paranoia only worsened. Frankie began seeing traitors in every corner. He stopped trusting his lieutenants, stopped trusting his soldiers. He even stopped trusting Tony, the man who had driven him for years. One night, Frankie had Tony followed by two of his men. When Tony met with a cousin at a diner, Frankie was convinced it was a meeting with the feds. He dragged Tony into the back room of the inn, pistol in hand. "Who'd you talk to?" Frankie demanded. "My cousin," Tony stammered, terrified. "My cousin, I swear. He runs a grocery. That's it." Frankie pressed the gun against his temple. His hand trembled, his eyes bloodshot. For a long moment, the room was silent, except for Tony's ragged breathing. Finally, Frankie lowered the pistol. "You lied to me once. You're dead." Tony nodded, sweat dripping down his face. He had never felt fear like that, not from the cops, not from Manhattan, but from the man he had served for years. Meanwhile, Capone's legend grew louder. He began meeting with Chicago men in secret, slipping away under the excuse of Brooklyn business. Word spread that Chicago wanted him badly, wanted him to run their bootlegging empire, wanted him to be their king. Men in Brooklyn whispered too. They said Frankie was finished, that the feds had him cornered, that he was unraveling. They said Capone was the future, not just for Brooklyn, but for the whole country. Capone didn't deny it. He didn't boast either. He just smiled that faint smile of his, the one that said he already knew what everyone else was just beginning to realize. The trial date drew closer. Frankie spent his nights pacing his office, the summons papers spread before him, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. He muttered to himself, replaying every detail, every possibility. He barely ate. He didn't sleep at all. Lucy tried once more to reach him. She stood in the doorway, her voice trembling. "Frankie, please, this isn't life. Look at you. You're wasting away." He didn't look at her. "This is the only life there is." Tears filled her eyes. "You're going to die like this, alone, paranoid, surrounded by men who'll never love you the way I do." Frankie finally looked at her, his gaze sharp, cold. "Love doesn't keep you alive. Fear does." She left him then, slamming the door, her sobs echoing down the hall. Frankie lit another cigarette, exhaled smoke, and muttered to himself. Sleep is death. Love is weakness. Fear is all. Capone watched it all, the unraveling of his mentor. He saw the paranoia, the violence, the sleepless nights. He saw the way Frankie's men flinched when he entered a room, the way they looked at Capone instead. One night, Capone sat across from Frankie, pouring himself a drink. "You're burning out, boss," he said softly. Frankie glared at him. "I'm still standing." Capone smirked faintly. "For how long?" Frankie leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You think you're ready to take my place? You think you can carry this weight? You don't know what it means to rule." Capone's grin faded. He met Frankie's gaze, steady, unflinching. "Maybe I don't, but I know what it means to survive, and survival's bigger than Brooklyn." The silence stretched, heavy as a coffin. Frankie exhaled smoke, his eyes hollow. He knew what Capone was saying. He knew the boy was already halfway gone. Brooklyn whispered louder than ever. They whispered that Frankie Yale was finished, that the feds had him cornered, that his sleepless nights had driven him mad. They whispered that Al Capone was the future, that Chicago was calling, that the boy had outgrown the master. Frankie heard the whispers. He sat alone in his office, cigarette smoke curling, eyes bloodshot, muttering to himself. The trial was coming. The feds were closing in, and his own protege, his hammer, his fire, was ready to leave him behind. Frankie Yale, the sleepless king of Brooklyn, felt it in his bones. The end was near. The courtroom smelled of sweat and polished wood, heavy with the weight of 100 eyes. The ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, stirring the air but doing nothing to ease the tension. Reporters packed the benches, pencils scratching, cameras flashing. This wasn't just a trial, it was a show. And the star, whether he liked it or not, was Frankie Yale. He walked in wearing a tailored suit, hat pulled low, his face carved from stone. To the casual eye, he looked calm, confident, even arrogant, but inside, Frankie was hollow. His eyes burned from nights without sleep. His hands trembled faintly as he adjusted his tie. He had told himself that rest was death, but now the lack of it was eating him alive. When the judge entered and the gavel struck, Frankie barely heard it. His mind was racing, muttering to itself, replaying every whisper, every betrayal. The prosecutor, a tall, sharp-faced man with cold eyes, laid out the case with relish. Tax evasion, racketeering, bootlegging, ledgers seized from warehouses, testimony from former associates. That was the knife that twisted. Men who had once sworn loyalty, men Frankie had fed, protected, raised from the gutter, were now sitting in the witness chair, pointing their fingers at him. Their voices shook, but their words were clear. Frankie Yale was the mastermind of Brooklyn's empire. Frankie Yale had orchestrated everything. Frankie Yale had made them complicit. Frankie sat there, his jaw clenched, eyes narrowed, staring at each man as if he could kill them with a look. In his mind, he did. In his mind, he put a bullet in each one. But in reality, he was forced to sit, silent, as they betrayed him. Capone was in the gallery that day, leaning back in his chair, watching with sharp eyes. He wasn't smiling. For once, he looked serious, thoughtful. He watched the reporters scribble, the prosecutors smirk, the judge frown. He watched Frankie, his mentor, unravel under the weight of the law. Later, outside the courthouse, Capone lit a cigarette, the flashbulbs from cameras popping around him. Reporters crowded, shouting his name. "Capone, did you lead the ambush on the docks?" "Capone, are you next in line if Yale goes down?" "Capone, are you heading to Chicago?" Capone smirked faintly, exhaling smoke. "Brooklyn's my home," he said smoothly. "But a man's got to go where the business is." The reporters scribbled furiously. Capone turned, his eyes glinting. He didn't say Chicago outright. He didn't have to. Inside the courtroom, Frankie tried to fight. His lawyers argued that the ledgers were fabricated, that the witnesses were liars, that the case was built on hearsay. But the evidence stacked up. The numbers were too precise, the witnesses too detailed. At one point, Frankie's own voice broke through the silence. "You think I built Brooklyn on paper?" he shouted, slamming his hand against the table. "Paper don't mean nothing. Men mean something. Fear means something. Paper burns." The judge slammed the gavel, demanding order. Reporters scribbled faster, grinning at the spectacle. The prosecutor smirked. Knowing Frankie's outburst only made him look desperate. Frankie sat back down, breathing heavy, his hands trembling. He lit a cigarette, ignoring the judge's glare, muttering to himself, "Paper burns. Paper burns." That night, back at the Harvard Inn, Frankie sat alone in his office, the papers from court spread before him. His hands shook as he poured himself a drink, his eyes hollow, his face pale. Tony entered quietly, setting his hat on the desk. "Boss," he said softly, "it ain't looking good. The witnesses, the ledgers, they've got you cornered." Frankie glared at him, his eyes bloodshot. "Nobody corners me." "Nobody?" Tony hesitated. "Capone's been meeting with Chicago men. I think he's making plans." Frankie froze, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. Slowly, he looked up at Tony. "Plans?" he asked coldly. Tony nodded. "They're offering him everything. Territory, money, power. He could be running Chicago within a year." Frankie's jaw tightened. He exhaled smoke, muttering to himself. Ungrateful little bastard. The next day in court, another betrayal landed the final blow. Meyer Lansky, one of the bookkeepers Frankie had once trusted, took the stand. He spoke calmly, clearly, laying out the numbers, the shipments, the bribes. He didn't flinch under Frankie's glare. He didn't hesitate. When the prosecutor asked him why he was testifying, Meyer answered simply, "Because loyalty doesn't mean suicide. Frankie Yale is finished. Everyone knows it." Frankie's face went red with rage. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting, "You little rat, I'll see you in the river." The judge banged the gavel furiously, threatening contempt. Frankie didn't care. He couldn't stop himself. He had spent his life demanding loyalty, building it through fear and respect. And now, in the open, it was crumbling. That night, Capone visited Frankie at the inn. He walked into the office, poured himself a drink, and sat across from his mentor. "You looked weak in there," Capone said bluntly. Frankie glared at him. "Careful, kid." Capone smirked faintly. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. The papers, the men, even the feds, they see blood in the water. You're slipping." Frankie leaned forward, his eyes burning. "And you think you can do better? You think you can sit in this chair and hold it all together?" Capone met his gaze, calm, confident. "Not here, not Brooklyn, but in Chicago, yeah, I can do better. I can do bigger." The silence between them was thick, electric. Frankie's hand twitched toward his pistol, but he didn't draw it. Capone just sipped his drink, watching him. For the first time, Frankie realized the truth. Capone wasn't his protege anymore. He wasn't his hammer, his student, his fire. He was his replacement. The trial dragged on for weeks, but the outcome was clear. The feds had him. The witnesses had buried him. The ledgers had painted the picture too vividly. Frankie's lawyers fought hard, but they were swinging at ghosts. One evening, Frankie sat alone in his office staring at the papers. His cigarette burned down to ash, untouched. His hands trembled as he muttered to himself, "They think they can bury me. They think paper is stronger than blood. They're wrong. They're all wrong." But deep down, he knew. The feds were closing in. His men were abandoning him. Capone was leaving for Chicago, and Frankie Yale, the sleepless king of Brooklyn, was standing at the edge of the cliff with nothing left to hold him steady. Brooklyn whispered it openly now. They whispered that Frankie was finished, that the trial had broken him, that his sleeplessness had driven him mad. They whispered that Capone was already half gone, already wearing a crown in Chicago. Frankie heard the whispers. He sat alone in his office, muttering to himself, his pistol always within reach. The law was coming. His allies were gone, and the boy he had mentored was no longer beside him. He was ahead of him, and Frankie knew it in his bones, that his end was closer than ever. The trial was still dragging on, but Frankie was already a dead man walking in the eyes of the city. The newspapers wrote him off daily. The feds had their evidence stacked high. Manhattan smelled weakness, and worse than all of that, his own men had begun to doubt. For Frankie, doubt was the same as betrayal, and betrayal had only one cure. The first body fell on a Wednesday night. A soldier named Carlo Jr., no relation to the first Carlo who had betrayed him, was dragged into the back room of the Harvard Inn. Frankie had heard whispers, vague ones, that the boy had spoken to a detective on the corner. That was enough. Frankie sat at the head of the table, eyes bloodshot, cigarette trembling between his fingers. The boy knelt before him, begging, swearing on his mother's grave. "I didn't say nothing, boss, I swear. They stopped me in the street, that's all. I didn't give 'em nothing." Frankie's hand twitched on the pistol. His face was calm, but his eyes were wild. Talking is enough. Talking is betrayal. Before the boy could protest, Frankie raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The blast echoed, blood sprayed across the floorboards, and the boy slumped forward. The men watching were silent, pale. Frankie's hand trembled as he reloaded, muttering to himself, "Better dead than a rat. Better dead than a traitor." The message spread fast. Frankie was killing his own now, not just enemies. And fear turned to unease. Capone heard about it the next morning. He walked into Frankie's office, his usual grin gone. "You're killing kids now," Capone said flatly. Frankie glared at him. "Kids turn into rats. You cut them before they grow." Capone shook his head, his voice sharp. "No, boss. You're not cutting snakes anymore. You're cutting your own legs out from under you. The men are scared, and not of the feds, not of D'Aquila, of you." Frankie slammed his fist onto the desk, his eyes blazing. "Let them be scared. Fear is loyalty. Fear keeps men in line." Capone leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. "Fear makes men leave, and they're leaving, Frankie. They're looking to me. They're looking to Chicago. They're looking anywhere but here." The silence between them was heavy. Frankie's hand twitched toward his pistol, but he didn't draw it. Capone held his gaze, unflinching. "You think you're bigger than me," Frankie said softly, almost a whisper. "You think you can walk out of here and build something without me?" Capone smirked faintly. "I don't think. I know." Then he turned and walked out, leaving Frankie alone with his smoke and his muttering. The killings didn't stop. Frankie ordered 2 more men shot in alleys, their bodies dumped in the river. One was accused of talking to the press, another of skimming money. Whether the accusations were true didn't matter. Frankie was bleeding paranoia, and paranoia demanded sacrifices. The Harvard Inn became a graveyard of whispers. Men drank with their backs to the wall, their eyes darting toward the office door. Some stopped coming altogether. Others quietly slipped away, joining Manhattan crews or heading west. Every night, Frankie sat in his office, maps and ledgers spread before him, cigarette smoke thick in the air. He muttered to himself, replaying every whisper, every betrayal. His hands trembled constantly now, his eyes hollow. Sleep was a stranger he no longer even tried to court. Tony, loyal to the end, tried once more to reach him. "Boss," he said softly, "you're losing them. The men don't trust you anymore." Frankie looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Trust is a lie. Fear is all that matters." Tony hesitated, then asked, "And what about Capone?" Frankie's face darkened. He exhaled smoke, muttering, "He's gone already. Chicago's in his eyes. He thinks he's bigger than me." Tony swallowed. "Maybe he is." Frankie's gaze snapped to him, sharp as a blade. "Careful." Capone didn't wait for permission anymore. Within weeks he was gone, off to Chicago, where the bootleggers welcomed him with open arms. Word traveled fast. The boy from Brooklyn, Yale's hammer, had taken his first steps into his own empire. Frankie heard the whispers, the rumors of Capone's rise in Chicago. They cut deeper than any knife. The boy he had mentored, the boy he had sharpened, was now building his own throne. And worse, the men in Brooklyn whispered that Capone had left at just the right time, before Frankie's ship sank completely. Frankie sat in his office, staring at the smoke curling toward the ceiling, muttering to himself, "Ungrateful, ungrateful. He owes me everything." But deep down, he knew. Capone didn't owe him anymore. Capone had outgrown him. The feds tightened their grip. Raids came weekly now, tearing apart Frankie's operations. His money streams dried up, his soldiers scattered. Judges who once took envelopes now turned them away, their eyes fixed on Washington. The law wasn't just circling anymore. It was closing in. Frankie lashed out harder. He sent men to torch buildings, to shoot rivals in broad daylight, to send messages dripping in blood. But each act only drew more attention, more heat. The newspapers loved it, splashing his name across headlines. Yale's Brooklyn in chaos, blood runs in the streets. Former kingpin unraveling as men flee. Frankie read the headlines and laughed bitterly, muttering, paper burns, paper burns. But even he knew the truth. His empire wasn't burning on paper. It was burning in reality. One night, drunk and sleepless, Frankie stormed into the main hall of the Harvard Inn. The place was half empty, the few men inside drinking nervously. Frankie fired 2 shots into the ceiling, the blasts echoing through the room. "You think I'm finished?" he shouted, his voice wild. "You think the feds can touch me? You think Capone can replace me? I built this. I am Brooklyn." The men stared, pale, silent. Some nodded weakly, others avoided his eyes. Frankie's hands trembled as he lowered the gun, muttering to himself. Tony stepped forward, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Boss, please." "Sit down?" Frankie shoved him away. "Don't tell me what to do. Don't you ever tell me." Then he stormed back into his office, slamming the door, leaving the men in stunned silence. That was the night Brooklyn stopped fearing him. That was the night they started pitying him. Capone's name was everywhere now. Chicago whispered it with awe. The newspapers printed it with fear. He was no longer just Yale's protege. He was his own storm, his own fire. Frankie read the stories, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow. "Ungrateful," he muttered again and again. "He owes me." He owes me everything. But he knew Capone wasn't coming back. And Frankie Yale, the sleepless king of Brooklyn, was left alone in the ruins of his own making. Brooklyn whispered openly now. They whispered that Frankie was finished, that his paranoia had turned the streets red, that the feds were preparing to take him down for good. They whispered that Capone had left at the perfect time, that he was already building a kingdom in Chicago, bigger than Brooklyn ever could be. Frankie heard the whispers. He sat alone in his office, cigarette smoke curling, his pistol always within reach. The law was closing in. Capone was gone, and Brooklyn itself had stopped believing in him. For the first time in his life, Frankie felt it, the weight of his own isolation. He had built an empire out of fear, and now fear was all he had left. The Harvard Inn had never been quieter. The walls that once vibrated with jazz, laughter, and gunfire now sat heavy in silence, broken only by the creak of the floorboards and the low hum of the street outside. The few men who still showed their faces did so reluctantly, drinking in whispers, their eyes darting toward the office door like children afraid of a father's wrath. Frankie Yale sat in that office, hunched over his desk, cigarette smoke curling around him, his face pale and hollow. His suit was still sharp, his tie still knotted, but the man inside it was crumbling. He hadn't slept in days, maybe weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling constantly. On the desk lay three things: a pistol, a half-empty glass of whiskey, and the latest newspaper. Yale Empire crumbles. Chicago's Capone rises. The headline mocked him. He stared at it until his vision blurred, then muttered under his breath, "Paper burns. Paper always burns." He lit a match, held it to the paper, and watched the flames curl the edges until it turned to ash in the tray. But the words stayed. They never burned out of his head. The feds weren't circling anymore. They were closing in. Every week brought new raids, new indictments, new headlines. The ledgers they'd seized had painted too clear a picture. The witnesses they'd turned, rats, Frankie called them, were too convincing. Judges who had once taken envelopes now turned them away, their eyes fixed on Washington. Tony brought the news daily, his face pale with dread. "Boss, they've frozen accounts. They're seizing trucks before they even leave the docks. We're bleeding out." Frankie waved him off, muttering, "Money moves, money hides. They can't touch what they can't find." But he knew the money was drying up. The bribes weren't sticking. The machine was breaking. Manhattan smelled weakness. D'Aquila's men, once cautious of Brooklyn, now prowled openly. Two of Frankie's lieutenants were gunned down in broad daylight, their bodies left in the street like warnings. Another vanished completely, his family swearing he'd fled the city. Frankie's response was predictable: more blood. He ordered retaliations that same night. 3 men dragged from their homes and shot in the alleys. A Manhattan-owned speakeasy torched with everyone inside. A message painted on the wall in blood: "Brooklyn doesn't sleep." But the message no longer carried the weight it once had. The city didn't fear Frankie's wrath anymore. They pitied it. They saw not a king defending his throne, but a desperate man clawing its shadows. Capone's shadow loomed larger than Frankie's now. Chicago's papers screamed his name with fear and awe. "Capone takes Chicago by storm." The stories of his violence, his ruthlessness, his cunning, they spread like wildfire. And every time Frankie's name appeared in the press, it was in contrast. The fallen king of Brooklyn, the man the feds had in their sights. Frankie read those stories in silence, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. "Ungrateful," he muttered. "Ungrateful little bastard. He owes me everything." But deep inside, he knew Capone didn't owe him anymore. Capone was gone, and the world had moved on without Frankie Yale. Paranoia consumed him. He stopped trusting anyone. He stopped eating food he hadn't prepared himself. He made Tony switch cars 3 times a day. He had guards outside his house, outside the inn, outside every meeting place. But even that wasn't enough. One night, He had Tony stripped naked in the office to prove he wasn't wearing a wire. Another night, he woke his men at 3 in the morning and demanded they account for every minute of their day. The men whispered. Some laughed nervously. Others slipped away entirely, joining Diacola or fleeing the city. The circle around Frankie shrank smaller and smaller. The worst blow came not from Manhattan, not from the feds, but from within. A man named Rocco, one of Frankie's oldest lieutenants, vanished one night. 2 days later, he appeared in court as a witness for the prosecution. Tony brought Frankie the news, his face pale. "Boss," Rocco flipped, "he's talking." Frankie froze, his cigarette burning down to his fingers. He didn't flinch at the pain. He just sat there, staring into space, muttering. Rocco, Rocco, ungrateful, always ungrateful. That night, Frankie ordered Rocco's brother shot, not because the brother had betrayed him, but because someone had to pay. The man was dragged into the street and executed, his body left for the rats. It was the act of a man no longer calculating, no longer strategic. It was rage. It was desperation. And everyone saw it. By spring, the Harvard Inn was a tomb. The music was gone, the laughter gone, the men gone. Only Frankie remained, pacing his office, cigarette smoke thick, pistol always in hand. He muttered to himself constantly, conversations with ghosts, with enemies long dead, with Capone. Tony stayed, loyal to the end, but even he was fraying. He tried once more to reach his boss. "Frankie," he said softly one night, "you can't keep this up. The men are gone. The money's gone. The feds are coming. You can't fight everyone." Frankie turned on him, eyes blazing. "I've been fighting everyone my whole life. That's how I got here. That's how I'll stay here." Tony shook his head, his voice trembling. "No, boss. That's how you'll die here." Frankie didn't answer. He just lit another cigarette, staring at the maps on his desk, muttering. The whispers in Brooklyn grew louder. They whispered that Frankie Yale was finished, that his paranoia had turned him into a madman, that the feds would take him any day now, that Capone had left at the perfect time, building something bigger in Chicago. They whispered that Frankie's end was near. And Frankie heard them. He sat in his office, cigarette smoke curling, eyes hollow, pistol in hand. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Capone's grin. He saw rats testifying in court. He saw the feds kicking down his door. Sleep was death. And Frankie Yale knew death was closer than it had ever been. Brooklyn no longer belonged to him. It belonged to whispers, to fear, to Capone's shadow. Frankie was king of nothing now, a sleepless ghost haunting the ruins of his own empire, and the only thing left for him was the end. Frankie Yale had stopped being a man and started becoming a ghost long before the first bullets came for him. In those final weeks, he haunted the Harvard Inn like a restless spirit. The club still stood, but its music had died. Its laughter had dried up. Its soldiers had vanished one by one, some killed, some flipped, some simply gone. The only sound left was the shuffle of Frankie's shoes across the floorboards, the rasp of his muttering, and the scratch of his lighter sparking another cigarette. He didn't eat much anymore. He didn't drink much either. All he did was smoke, pace, and stare at the maps on his desk, as if they could still tell him where the power had gone. His eyes were hollow, red from endless nights without sleep. His hands trembled constantly, but he never let go of the pistol he kept on the table beside him. Tony stayed, though even he was fraying at the edges. He brought news from the streets, bad news, always bad. Another raid, another soldier flipped, another business seized, D'Aquila's men moving freely in Brooklyn now, mocking Frankie's name in the open. But Frankie didn't rage anymore. Rage had burned out of him, leaving only ashes. He just nodded, muttering to himself, "Paper burns, rats burn, they all burn." The betrayal came on a hot July morning. Frankie was in his house, slumped in a chair, cigarette dangling from his lips, when Tony entered with a face pale as death. "Boss," Tony whispered, "they're coming. The feds. They know where you are. Someone gave them everything." Frankie's eyes narrowed, his voice low. "Who?" Tony swallowed hard. Rocco, he gave them your roots, your houses, your... Frankie cut him off with a sharp gesture. His hands trembled as he lit another cigarette. Ungrateful. Always ungrateful. He stood, straightened his suit, adjusted his tie. For all his paranoia, all his sleepless nights, he still dressed like a king. "If they're coming," he said softly, "let them find me standing." But it wasn't the feds who found him first. That afternoon, Frankie left his house in his dark sedan. He insisted on driving himself. He didn't trust chauffeurs anymore. Tony sat in the passenger seat, silent, sweating under the heat. The city outside was restless, the streets humming with rumor. As they rolled down 14th Avenue, Frankie muttered to himself, eyes darting to every shadow, every window. "They're watching, always watching. But I don't sleep. I don't close my eyes." It was then that the car appeared, a black sedan sliding in behind them, another pulling up alongside. Tony stiffened. "Boss!" The first burst of gunfire shattered the summer air. The windows of Frankie's car exploded, glass spraying like diamonds. Frankie jerked the wheel, but bullets ripped through the metal, punching holes in the doors, tearing into the seats. Tony screamed, ducking low. Frankie snarled, gripping the wheel, his pistol raised. He fired wildly out the shattered window, shouting, "Brooklyn doesn't sleep!" But the storm didn't stop. The Thompson guns roared, tearing the car apart. Frankie's sedan swerved, slammed into a lamppost, and skidded to a halt. Smoke poured from the hood. Frankie stumbled out, blood soaking his suit, pistol still in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wild, his breath ragged. He raised the gun, firing blindly at the cars, his voice hoarse. "You think you can kill me? You think paper can kill me? I am Brooklyn." The gun clicked empty. Frankie staggered, trying to reload, but the assassins didn't give him the chance. Another burst of gunfire ripped through him, bullets tearing into his chest, his stomach, his arms. He fell to his knees, blood pouring, his pistol slipping from his hand. He gasped, coughing crimson, his eyes wide, staring at the sky. For a moment, silence fell. The assassins watched from their cars, smoke curling from their guns. Then, slowly, Frankie collapsed onto the hot pavement. The king of Brooklyn was dead. The newspapers had their feast the next morning. Frankie Yale gunned down in Brooklyn. Brooklyn Godfather falls in bloody ambush. Capone's mentor dead. New era begins. Reporters swarmed the scene, photographing the bullet-riddled car, the blood-stained pavement, the crowd of gawkers whispering about the end of an era. The cops stood around like vultures, muttering about gang wars, but everyone knew. This wasn't just a murder. This was a message. Frankie Yale had ruled through fear, through paranoia, through sleepless nights. But fear fades, paranoia devours, and sleeplessness kills. And now, he was just another body in the street. Capone got the news in Chicago. He was in a smoky back room, surrounded by new allies, when a messenger handed him the paper. Capone unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the headline, the photograph of Frankie's car riddled with holes. For a long moment, he said nothing. He just stared at the paper, his jaw tight, his face unreadable. Then he folded it neatly, set it on the table, and poured himself a drink. "To Frankie," he said softly. The men around him raised their glasses. Some smirked, some shrugged, some toasted without a thought. But Capone's eyes burned. He wasn't smiling. Frankie Yale had taught him everything, the value of fear, the price of loyalty, the danger of sleep. And now, Frankie was gone. His empire in ruins, his name splashed across headlines as a cautionary tale. Capone drank deeply, then set the glass down. He didn't mourn. He didn't cry. He just nodded to himself. The student had outlived the master, and now the throne was his. Back in Brooklyn, Frankie's funeral drew a crowd, but not a loyal one. Some came out of respect, others out of curiosity, many just to make sure he was truly gone. The church was filled with whispers, not prayers. Whispers about Capone, about Chicago, about the future. Tony stood near the coffin, pale, silent, eyes hollow. He had survived the ambush. but he hadn't saved his boss. Maybe no one could have. As Frankie's coffin was lowered into the ground, the whispers grew louder. The Godfather of Brooklyn was gone. The city would move on. And the legend of Al Capone was just beginning. In the end, Frankie Yale's life was a lesson written in blood and smoke. He had built an empire on fear, but fear erodes. He had demanded loyalty, but loyalty breaks. He had refused sleep, calling it death, and in the end, death came anyway, in the daylight, with guns blazing. Frankie's story was not one of peace, or wisdom, or redemption. It was a story of paranoia, betrayal, and the inevitable fall of kings. And somewhere, in Chicago, a new king sharpened his crown, carrying Frankie's lessons forward, ready to carve his own empire out of blood. Frankie Yale, the sleepless king of Brooklyn, was gone. But his shadow lived on, in every bullet Al Capone ever fired, in every whisper of fear that drifted through America's underworld, in every sleepless night another gangster spent waiting for the knock at the door. Because Frankie had been right about one thing: sleep is death. And in the world he built, no king ever truly slept.